Hey, welcome back. Tonight we're talking about a goddess who was literally born from the ocean, had the most dramatic love life on Mount Olympus, and somehow managed to start a war just by existing. Aphrodite. You think you know her? Pretty face, a couple doves, the goddess of Valentine's Day vibes. But the real story? Way more chaotic, way more powerful, and honestly kind of terrifying. Before we dive in, real quick, drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious what corner of the world is up late learning about ancient Greek drama with me. No wrong answers, bonus points if it's 3 a.m. and you have work tomorrow. Alright, lights low, phone down, let's get into it. By the end of this video you're going to see Aphrodite completely differently, not as a symbol of romance, but as one of the most dangerous forces in the entire Greek pantheon. And it all starts with how she came into existence in the first place. So let's start at the very beginning. And when it comes to Aphrodite, the beginning is already a problem. Because there isn't just one, there are two. Two completely separate, contradictory, equally ancient stories about how the goddess of love came into existence. And the fact that the Greeks never bothered to pick a favourite says something deeply revealing about how they understood love itself. Not as a simple, tidy thing. Not as a feeling you could trace back to a single clean origin. But as something complicated, layered, and a little bit dangerous from the very start. Most deities in the Greek world had relatively straightforward origin stories. Zeus was born on Crete, hidden from his father, raised by nymphs, eventually staged a rebellion, and took over the cosmos. A fairly recognizable career arc for an ambitious young deity. Apollo and Artemis were born on the floating island of Delos, because every other landmass in the world had refused to host their mother Leto during labour, which sounds like an incredibly stressful logistical situation for everyone involved, but particularly for Leto. Hermes was born at dawn, and by sunset had already stolen cattle and invented the lyre, which suggests that some gods simply arrive in the world already knowing exactly who they are and what they're going to do with their time. Aphrodite is not that kind of deity. Aphrodite arrives in the world through two completely different front doors, and both of them are strange. She is the only Olympian to have not one but two competing, structurally incompatible origin stories, both of which were treated as equally valid by ancient sources, and both of which tell you something completely different about what she fundamentally is. The first story is the older one, and it comes from Hesiod, a poet working somewhere around the 8th or 7th century BCE, who had a particular talent for making the very distant past feel vivid and slightly unsettling. His version of Aphrodite's birth is embedded in a much larger story about the origins of the universe itself, which means that before you even get to the goddess of love, you have to sit through the entire history of cosmic succession. Think of it as the world's least convenient backstory. There is no way to skip to the relevant part without losing the context that makes it meaningful. In Hesiod's telling, the universe begins with chaos. Not chaos in the everyday sense of things being disorganized, but chaos as in the void, the formless expanse that precedes everything. Out of chaos come the first primordial beings: Gaia, the earth; Tartarus, the deep abyss below the earth; Eros, a first principle of attraction; Erebus, the darkness; and night. These are not gods in the later sense. They are more like fundamental conditions of existence, forces so basic that the universe cannot be said to exist without them. They do not have personalities exactly. They have natures, and their natures shape everything that follows. Gaia produces Uranus, the sky, on her own, without any assistance, which is either remarkably self-sufficient or a sign that reproduction worked somewhat differently before the universe had time to develop proper conventions about these things. Uranus becomes both her partner and, in fairly short order, her most pressing domestic problem. He turns out to be the kind of partner who makes large decisions on behalf of the family without consulting anyone, and then seems genuinely surprised by the resentment this generates. The specific problem is that Uranus, apparently dissatisfied with several of the children born from his union with Gaia, takes to pushing them back into the earth the moment they emerge into the world. He does this to the Cyclops and to the 100-handed ones, the Hecatonchires, apparently on the grounds that they are too powerful and too strange for his comfort. Gaia, who has been carrying these children and experiencing their forced return with considerably less equanimity than Uranus seems to expect, eventually decides that something has to be done. She creates a great sickle, a curved blade of grey flint, and asks her children if any of them would be willing to address the situation directly. Only Cronus agrees. He is the youngest of the Titans, which may explain either his boldness or his calculation or possibly both. He takes the sickle, he hides, he waits for the right moment. When Uranus comes down to lie with Gaia, which is in this cosmological framework literally the sky descending to meet the earth, Cronus acts. He swings the sickle and separates sky from earth in the most permanent way imaginable. He throws what he has severed into the sea behind him and does not look back. Uranus, departing the story in considerable pain and understandable fury, pronounces a curse on Cronus, that Cronus will in turn be overthrown by his own children. It is one of mythology's better examples of a dying man's words turning out to be accurate. But that particular consequence is still several generations away. For the moment, the sea is receiving something remarkable. What lands in the water begins to transform. Hesiod describes it with a kind of circumspect poetry. He's working around something that he clearly finds both significant and difficult to articulate directly, which is itself interesting given that Hesiod was generally not shy about narrating difficult events. The sea around the impact point begins to foam. The Greek word for this foam is ___, quote __0 __, and it has given us, directly and without much alteration, the goddess's name. This is not a coincidence or a poetic flourish. Hesiod is being etymologically precise. The foam is the origin, and the origin is in the name, and the name carries the origin inside it every time anyone says it. From within the foam, over what Hesiod implies is a period of time rather than an instantaneous event, something begins to form. The chaos in the water organizes itself into shape, the way cream in a churning sea might thicken and gather and solidify, except that what forms is not cream but a girl, and then not a girl but a goddess, fully present and fully herself, in a way that requires no further development or growth. She drifts, carried by current and wind and the slow cooperation of the sea, toward the island of Cyprus. The hours, the goddesses of the seasons and of proper timing, are waiting for her on the shore. This detail passes quickly in the text, but it is oddly moving if you stay with it. The hours are among the more orderly figures in Greek mythology. They govern the regular turning of the year, the arrival of each season in its proper sequence, the reliable cyclical nature of time as opposed to the formless chaos that preceded it. Their presence at Aphrodite's landing suggests that even this most unplanned of arrivals, a goddess born from catastrophe, from the turbulent contact between violence and the sea, belongs somewhere in the structure of things. The chaos that produced her resolves into something that the goddesses of order are prepared to receive. The hours clothe her in flowers and woven robes, arrange gold ornaments at her wrists and throat, weave flowers through her hair. Hesiod lingers on these details in a way that feels ceremonial, as if the very act of describing her adornment is itself a form of homage, as if the poem is participating in the ritual of her arrival. Then they lead her to Olympus, and the other gods see her, and, as Hesiod tells it, all of them immediately want her. Every one of them. Not as a collective decision or a reasoned response, but as an automatic reaction, like a reflex, like the involuntary turning of a face toward warmth. This is a very efficient piece of mythological characterization. In a few lines, Hesiod has established that Aphrodite's power operates outside of conscious choice. The gods don't decide to desire her, they simply do. She hasn't spoken or acted or demonstrated anything. She has only arrived. And her arrival is sufficient to reorganize the emotional landscape of Olympus around itself. This will turn out to be significant to understanding everything she does in the mythology going forward. The second origin story is, on the surface, much more conventional. It appears primarily in Homer, specifically in the Iliad, during a scene where Aphrodite has been injured on the battlefield at Troy. In Homer's world, the gods are permitted to take sides in the war, and Aphrodite, who has a significant personal investment in the Trojan outcome, given her role in the entire Helen situation, gets a little too close to the fighting and takes a wound to her wrist from the Greek hero Diomedes. She retreats from the battlefield in considerable distress. What happens next is unexpectedly domestic. Aphrodite flees to Olympus, and rather than going anywhere official or stately, goes directly to her mother, a figure named Dione, who receives her daughter with quiet composure, takes the wounded wrist in her hands, and begins speaking in the careful, measured way of a parent trying to reframe a bad experience without dismissing the pain. Dione lists other gods who have been injured by mortals and survived, establishing a kind of precedent. This happens, she says, and it passes, and you will be fine. It is, by the standards of Homeric epic, a remarkably intimate scene. The greatest martial poem in Western literature pauses for a moment to give us a mother holding her daughter's hand, which tells you something about what Homer thought mattered. The mother's name, Dion, deserves more attention than it usually gets. Linguistically, Dion is simply the feminine form of Zeus. Both names derive from the same Proto-Indo-European root related to the sky, to light, to divine power broadly understood. Quote 1 and quote 2 are, etymologically, the same word wearing different grammatical clothing. This suggests that Dian may represent something very old, possibly a great sky goddess whose profile was systematically reduced as the Greek pantheon developed, leaving only her connection to Aphrodite as a trace of her former importance. Some scholars have connected her to similar figures in other Indo-European traditions, which would mean that the Homeric version of Aphrodite's lineage actually encodes some of the oldest layers of the mythological tradition, hidden beneath its apparent conventionality. Homer does not explain the contradiction between his version and Hesiod's. He does not acknowledge that another version exists. He simply uses the version that serves his narrative, a goddess who can be hurt, who has a mother, who exists within a family structure that makes psychological sense, and leaves the sea foam where it is. The two traditions sit side by side in the ancient world, without anyone apparently feeling the need to produce a committee report on which one is correct. Considering what each version actually implies about the nature of love begins to clarify why both were maintained. The Hesiodic Aphrodite, born from the oldest ocean, from the residue of cosmic upheaval, from events that predated the current order of things, embodies love as an autonomous force. She owes her existence to no god, belongs to no dynasty, was not planned or sanctioned or arranged by any divine authority. She is genuinely prior to the Olympians, prior to the political structures of the new cosmic age, prior to all the careful negotiations and social arrangements by which the world of the gods organizes itself into something manageable. She carries the primal world inside her. She's what happens when the universe, violent and in the process of rearranging itself, produces something beautiful entirely by accident and without any particular intention. This version of love as something that arrives from outside the established order, that respects no hierarchies, that answers to nothing except its own logic, is recognizable to anyone who has ever been on the receiving end of it. This is the love that shows up in Greek tragedy over and over again, dismantling kingdoms, destroying careful plans, making otherwise sensible people do things they would never consider under normal circumstances. It is not malicious. It simply operates according to its own rules, which happen to be incompatible with most of the rules that social life depends on for its stability. The ancient Greeks had a word for this kind of disruption. They called it, quote, 3 the madness sent by the gods, and Aphrodite was its most reliable source. The Homeric Aphrodite, daughter of Zeus, sister of the other Olympians, member of the divine hierarchy, embodies love as something embedded in the social world. Here, love has a context. It has a family. It has obligations and relationships and the specific vulnerabilities that come from caring about people who can also be hurt. A love goddess who can be wounded by a mortal and needs her mother to hold her hand is a love goddess who is genuinely present in human experience, not hovering above it at a safe and comfortable elevation. She knows what it is to be in the world, to be affected by it, to find that even divine power does not insulate you from the basic condition of having a body and being in proximity to other beings who also have bodies and sharper than expected weapons. This version of love as part of the social fabric, love that exists within relationships and institutions and the ordinary texture of daily life, is equally recognizable. This is the love that makes civilization possible, that motivates people to build households and participate in the structures that hold communities together. It is less dramatic than the primal version, and considerably less likely to start wars, but it is more sustainable and more broadly distributed. Everybody gets to have some of this one. What the Greeks seem to understand in maintaining both versions simultaneously is that these are not two different things that happen to share a name. They are two aspects of a single phenomenon that cannot be reduced to either one alone. Every experience of love that a person has contains elements of both, the uncontrollable pull of the seafoam goddess and the familiar socially embedded presence of the daughter of Zeus. The first time you feel drawn to someone, there is something oceanic and ungovernable about it. It arrives unbidden, It reorganizes your attention without consulting you about whether now is a good time, and simultaneously, that same attraction is shaped by everything you are as a social person, your history, your family, your cultural context, the particular world you happen to grow up in. Tearing the two apart, choosing the cosmic and dismissing the personal, or choosing the personal and dismissing the cosmic, produces something incomplete. The Greeks knew this. Their solution was to give both versions equal standing, to tell both stories as true, and to leave the synthesis to the individual. The philosopher Plato, writing several centuries after both Hesiod and Homer, pushed this distinction into explicit philosophical territory. In the Symposium, a dialogue about the nature of love structured as a series of speeches to dinner party, which is honestly a better format for philosophy than most people give it credit for, a character named Pausanias argues that there are demonstrably two Aphrodites and therefore two kinds of love. He calls them the heavenly Aphrodite, associated with the ancient non-maternal sea-foam origin, and the common or earthly Aphrodite, associated with Zeus and Dione and the generation of the current gods. Pausanias argues that the heavenly Aphrodite governs love of a higher and more lasting kind, love oriented toward character rather than appearance, toward wisdom and virtue rather than immediate pleasure, toward things that do not change with the seasons or fade as years pass. The earthly Aphrodite governs love that is more immediate and sensory and less discriminating, love that goes after anyone, that is satisfied with the surface of things, that does not particularly ask who a person is beneath what you can see from across the room. This distinction became one of the most influential ideas in Western philosophy and art. The Neoplatonists of late antiquity elaborated it into extended metaphysical systems with extraordinary enthusiasm. Christian thinkers adapted it into frameworks for distinguishing between sacred and profane love, between love that elevates the soul and love that keeps it earthbound. Medieval poets worked with it. Renaissance painters depicted it repeatedly and with significant creative license regarding clothing. The distinction between spiritual and carnal love, between agape and eros, between love that redeems and love that merely satisfies, all of this traces back in one form or another to two competing Greek birth stories that the ancient world never bothered to rationalize into a single account. The untidiness, in other words, was extraordinarily productive. A mythology that had resolved the question of Aphrodite's origins would have given us a tidier story. What it actually gave us, by leaving the contradiction in place, was a way of thinking about love that has been generating philosophical, theological, and artistic consequences for roughly 2,500 years. This seems like a reasonable trade for the inconvenience of an unresolved inconsistency. There is a geographical dimension to the birth story that opens up further layers if you're willing to follow it. When Aphrodite drifts from the sea to land, her first stop is the island of Cythera, a relatively small island south of the Peloponnese that had its own ancient cult dedicated to a goddess with her characteristics. Archaeological evidence places goddess worship at Cythera well back into the Bronze Age, which means this was an active religious site for centuries before the Greeks we usually think of as quote, _4 were writing things down. The cult there may have been among the earliest forms of what eventually became the Aphrodite tradition. From Cythera she continues to Cyprus, and this is where the story becomes more geographically interesting. Cyprus is not simply the island where Aphrodite landed. Cyprus is one of the key transit points through which Near Eastern religious traditions entered the Greek world, and the goddess who arrived on its shores had been accumulating cultural histories for longer than any single tradition's records go back. The Phoenicians, who maintained a significant presence on Cyprus throughout the Bronze and Iron Ages, worshipped Astarte, a goddess with a very similar portfolio to Aphrodite: beauty, love, fertility, the sea, and the celestial world, particularly the planet Venus. Astarte was one of the major deities of the Levantine world, worshipped from Sidon to Carthage to the temples of Cyprus, and her character and iconography overlapped with Aphrodite's in ways that are too consistent to be coincidental. The dove, which later becomes one of Aphrodite's signature animals, was also sacred to Astarte. The myrtle tree, closely associated with Aphrodite in Greek ritual, had similar associations in the Near Eastern tradition. The great sanctuary at Paphos on Cyprus, which became the most important pilgrimage site in the entire Aphrodite cult, sits directly on layers of Bronze Age worship that precede the Greek presence on the island by centuries. The Mesopotamian tradition adds another layer. Inanna, later known as Ishtar, was the great goddess of love and war in the Sumerian and Akkadian worlds, a deity of enormous complexity and power, associated simultaneously with erotic love and the chaos of battle, with the morning star and the evening star, with descent into the underworld and return from it. The parallels between Ishtar and Aphrodite are striking enough that scholars have debated for a long time whether they represent parallel independent developments of a similar archetype or direct cultural transmission. The answer, at this point, appears to be both, and on Cyprus in particular, the two traditions became so intertwined that the question of which element came from where is largely unanswerable. The layers are too deep and too thoroughly mixed. What this means for understanding the birth myths is significant. Aphrodite's double origin, the ancient pre-Olympian sea-foam version, and the integrated, family-embedded Olympian version, may reflect something real about how the goddess herself came to be in historical terms. She is, in a genuine historical sense, a synthesis. She arrived in the Greek world already carrying the accumulated theology of multiple cultures, multiple centuries of goddess worship, multiple traditions of understanding what the force of love and beauty and desire is and how it operates in the world. The Seafoam story may preserve something of that ancient, multicultural pre-Olympian character, the goddess who predates any particular tradition's framework. The Daughter of Zeus story reflects the process of cultural integration, the attempt by Greek mythmakers to give this ancient and somewhat unruly figure a comprehensible place within the orderly family structure of Olympus, where every deity has a clear genealogy and a defined role. Both stories are, in this reading, historically true in different senses. One records what the tradition felt like from the inside, that there was something about Aphrodite that preceded and exceeded the current order. The other records what the tradition looked like after the integrative work was done, a goddess with a defined place, a clear lineage, a manageable relationship to the other divine powers of the Greek world. She's simultaneously older than the system and fully part of it, which is an unusual position to hold, but one she apparently navigates without much visible difficulty. The detail that Hesiod gives about grass and flowers growing wherever Aphrodite walks as she comes ashore is easily overlooked but worth examining carefully. It is not presented as a miracle or a deliberate act. She's not performing fertility like a special effect. She simply walks, and growth follows her the way heat follows a fire, as the natural consequence of what she is, not of anything she has decided to do. Living things grow because of her presence, not because she has issued any instruction to that effect. This image helps explain why Aphrodite had roles in the agricultural calendar that her reputation as a love goddess doesn't obviously account for. Certain of her festivals were timed to planting seasons. Gardens were consecrated in her name. Sailors prayed to her not only in matters of the heart, but for safe passage and favourable winds. These are not the obvious portfolio of a goddess whose primary concern is romantic relationships. But they make complete sense if you understand her as the embodiment of the generative principle more broadly. The force that draws things toward other things, that produces combination and growth and life from what would otherwise be isolated elements, drifting in a void without ever meeting. This connects directly to the cosmological detail mentioned earlier, that Eros, the principle of attraction, was present at the very creation of the universe. Aphrodite, in this understanding, is not simply a member of the Olympian staff assigned to the love portfolio. She is the personification of a principle that operates at every level of existence, from the cosmic physics of matter attracting matter to the specific shattering human experience of wanting someone in particular. She is the version of that principle that has a face and a name and a history, the version that beings capable of suffering and hoping and choosing can enter into relationship with. This is why she matters in ways that a purely abstract cosmological force could never matter. She is the love that looks back at you. There is a philosophical wrinkle in the Hesiodic birth story that tends to get glossed over in popular retellings. If Eros already exists at the very beginning of things, if attraction and desire are built into the structure of the cosmos before even the first gods appear, then what exactly is Aphrodite? What does she govern, if the thing she's supposed to embody was already in operation long before she was born? The answer the Greeks seem to have settled on is something like this. The original Eros is impersonal, cosmic, and entirely indifferent. It is the force that makes atoms combine, that pulls one body of matter toward another, that drives the universe toward complexity and form, without caring in the slightest about what any particular entity experiences in the process. Aphrodite is what happens when that force enters the realm of awareness and meaning. She is eros as it is experienced by beings who can suffer for it, hope because of it, make choices that are shaped by it, build cities and write poems and, yes, occasionally start wars in its name. She's not a redundant deity. She's the translation of a cosmic principle into something that conscious beings can actually encounter and be changed by. This makes her simultaneously smaller and larger than the original Eros. Smaller, because she operates within the particular world of persons and relationships rather than across the entire breadth of existence. Larger, because her domain is the domain of everything that makes conscious life genuinely consequential. It is one thing for matter to be attracted to other matter in a purely mechanical sense. It is another thing entirely for a person to love someone, to long for them, to organize their existence around a single absence, to find that the world looks different from the side of having loved than it did from the side of not having loved yet. The birth story, then, is not just a story about origins. It is a story about what kind of force love is and why it matters that a specific goddess embodies it, rather than leaving it as an abstract principle with no address and no name. The sea foam, the severed sky, the drifting girl, the waiting hours. All of this is a way of saying that love has a history, that it arrived in the world through a specific set of circumstances, that it is connected to the violence and the generativity that shaped everything that came before it. And it is also a way of saying that love is old. Older than the current gods. Older than the current order. Older, in some versions, than almost anything else. The position Aphrodite occupies within the Olympian order becomes visible only when you look at it through the lens of her origin. Among the major Olympians, she is the only one whose divine generation is genuinely ambiguous. Zeus and Hera are children of Cronus. Apollo, Artemis, Hermes all have clear parentage within the current cosmic dispensation. Aphrodite, in the Hesiodic version, belongs to the generation before Zeus. She's a remnant of the previous era that somehow made it through the transition intact, which is, when you think about it, a remarkable thing to have managed. Most things from the Age of the Titans did not make it through intact. The Titans themselves were defeated and imprisoned in Tartarus. The Cyclops were eventually freed to serve Zeus, but remained somewhat marginal figures in the mythology going forward. The Hekatonchires were given important jobs guarding the imprisoned Titans, which is the divine equivalent of being reassigned to security detail rather than kept in the main lineup. The world of the previous age was systematically dismantled, and its elements subordinated to the new order. Except for Aphrodite. She alone of the truly ancient powers makes it into the new dispensation as a full participant, welcomed, desired, feared, and respected in equal measure. And the implicit reason, visible in the structure of the mythology without ever being spelled out directly, is simple. You cannot imprison desire. You cannot lock the experience of wanting something in a pit somewhere and expect that to resolve the situation. Desire is not a separate power that operates independently of the people who will need to be governed. It is a power that operates through them, inside them, as part of the basic experience of being a conscious being in a world that contains other conscious beings. Every god who considered putting Aphrodite somewhere manageable would have first had to want to put her somewhere manageable, which is already her jurisdiction. She is the one element of the old world that the new world cannot do without, and therefore the one element it cannot exclude or confine. She walks into Olympus not because Zeus decrees it, but because an Olympus without desire is simply not a coherent concept. The gods who receive her are already living proof of her jurisdiction over them. Whether she emerged from the sea foam of the ancient ocean, shaped by the collision between cosmic violence and the world's first waters, or whether she was raised in the halls of Olympus as the daughter of the sky's highest authority, the conclusion is the same. A goddess arrives. The grass grows in her wake, the hours bring garlands, and Olympus, for all its politics and hierarchy and carefully maintained precedents, finds itself reorganized around the fact of her presence. That is an unusual thing to be able to say about any force, divine or otherwise, and it sets the stage for everything that follows in her mythology. Every love affair and conflict, every divine political entanglement, every mortal life transformed or complicated by her attention. All of it is the inevitable unfolding of a power that was never going to be anything other than what it is. Essential, unkillable, entirely impossible to domesticate, Regardless of which version of the birth story you happen to prefer, the goddess arrived on Cyprus, and Cyprus, to its considerable credit, understood immediately what it had received. This is not a small thing. Most places in the ancient world that found themselves associated with a major deity did so because somebody had a vision, or a statue washed ashore, or a particularly impressive natural formation convinced the locals that something divine was in the vicinity. Cyprus had all of these things, but more importantly it had geography, a specific, strategic, deeply consequential geography that made it one of the most important pieces of land in the entire Mediterranean world, and which transformed it, over centuries, into something that functioned less like an ordinary island and more like a living religious institution dedicated to the goddess of love. Which is, when you think about it, a remarkable thing to become. Sit with a map of the eastern Mediterranean for a moment. Cyprus hangs in the northeastern corner of the sea like a question mark, suspended between several worlds simultaneously. To the north, the Anatolian coast. To the east, the Levantine shore, the Phoenician cities of Tyre and Sidon, the ports that connected the Mediterranean to the vast inland networks of Mesopotamia. To the south, Egypt. To the west, the Greek world stretching back toward the Aegean. Any ship moving between any of these places in the ancient world had strong practical reasons to stop at Cyprus, because Cyprus had copper, so much copper and of such quality that the island literally gave the metal its name. The Latin quote 5 is simply a linguistic descendant of quote 6, which is what the Greeks called the island. Cyprus was copper, and copper was civilization. Tools, weapons, trading goods, the basic material infrastructure of the Bronze Age world. Every major power in the eastern Mediterranean had an interest in Cyprus, and this meant that Cyprus was one of the places where all of those powers met, traded, argued, and occasionally merged. For a goddess who was herself a synthesis, who arrived already carrying traditions from multiple cultures, already blending Near Eastern and pre-Greek and Minoan and Phoenician elements into a single divine figure, this was the ideal home. Cyprus was not just the place where she landed, it was the place that made her possible, in the same way that a particularly fertile estuary makes possible the kind of ecological complexity you simply cannot get in a single climate environment. The island was a crossroads, and the goddess of crossroads between people, which is in essence what a love deity is, found it entirely congenial. The main sanctuary at Paphos, on the southwestern coast of the island, is the oldest continuous religious site associated with Aphrodite, and its age is genuinely disorienting if you try to hold it in your head all at once. Archaeological investigation of the site has uncovered layers of worship going back to the late Bronze Age, roughly the 12th century BCE, with strong evidence that the location was considered sacred even before that. This means that people were performing religious rituals at Paphos for somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years before the texts we usually associate with quote 7 were composed. Hesiod and Homer were writing about a goddess whose primary temple was already ancient by their standards. They were, in a meaningful sense, newcomers to a tradition that had been running long before anyone thought to write it down. The sacred precinct at Paphos was unusual in the ancient world for several reasons, one of which is that it did not initially contain a statue of the goddess. Where most major Greek sanctuaries had a cult image, a sculpted representation of the deity, the central object of worship at Paphos was a stone. Specifically, a roughly conical stone of volcanic or meteoritic origin, polished and anointed with oil, which was treated as the goddess's physical presence in a way that no artistic representation could quite replicate. This is a very ancient form of religious practice. The worship of a sacred stone called a beetle is documented across the Near East and the Mediterranean going back to the Neolithic, and its persistence at one of the most important Greek religious sites says something significant about the continuity between the pre-Greek traditions on Cyprus and the Olympian religion that eventually incorporated them. The Greeks, when they arrived on Cyprus, did not build a Greek temple and put a Greek statue in it and consider the job done. They adapted to what was already there. The stone stayed. The tradition was absorbed rather than replaced. The annual festival at Paphos was one of the most elaborate religious events in the ancient Mediterranean world, and it drew pilgrims from a range of places that modern travel agents would describe as ambitious. The festival calendar centered on a reenactment of the goddess's birth, specifically a procession from the sanctuary down to the sea, where ritual bathing and purification took place, followed by a return to the temple that mirrored the original journey from the waves to the land. This was not a simple affair. The procession involved music, offerings of incense and flowers, the carrying of sacred objects, and a complex set of ritual performances that varied in their specifics over the centuries but maintained their basic structure across an extraordinarily long period of time. People came from mainland Greece, from the Aegean Islands, from Phoenicia, from Egypt. They came by sea, which was itself an act of faith, given the state of ancient navigation, and they came specifically to participate in the recreation of a divine origin story. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something about how ancient religious practice worked that is easy to miss from a modern distance. The procession to the sea was not a commemoration of something that had happened once, long ago, and was now being remembered the way you might mark a historical anniversary. It was understood as a genuine reenactment, as a participation in the original event that, through the ritual, became in some sense present again. The goddess was not simply being honoured for having been born from the sea in the mythological past. She was being born from the sea again, renewed, reconstituted in her power, made present in the world through the collective act of remembering and physically enacting her arrival. Every year, on Cyprus. It was the first morning again. The geography of the island beyond Paphos was also woven into the fabric of the cult, in ways that give you a sense of how thoroughly the theological and the topographical could be interwoven in ancient religious thinking. The rock formation off the southwestern coast known as Petra to Romiou, the Rock of the Greek, has been identified since antiquity as the specific spot where Aphrodite emerged from the sea. This identification is very old, pre-Christian certainly, and may go back to the Bronze Age. The formation itself is visually striking, a series of large pale rocks rising from the water close to shore, around which the currents create particularly notable patterns of foam under the right conditions. Whether the mythological association gave the foam its significance, or whether the observed foam suggested the mythological association, is the kind of chicken and egg question that tends to be unanswerable in ancient religious history. In practice, it doesn't much matter. The rocks and the story reinforced each other over centuries until each was unimaginable without the other. The myrtle groves around Paphos were sacred to the goddess. Roses, particularly red roses, which in one tradition were said to have gotten their colour from the goddess's blood when she was wounded by a thorn rushing to the aid of Adonis, were planted near her sanctuaries throughout the Greek world. But the Cypriot groves had a particular density and antiquity to them that gave them a quality of sacred domesticity. Like a garden that has been tended for so many generations, it has begun to seem natural rather than cultivated. The doves that nested in these groves were untouchable. They were the goddess's birds, and harming them was considered a very specific kind of impiety that was likely to attract a very specific kind of divine attention. This was not a vague theological principle. There are ancient accounts of people who harmed the sacred doves and subsequently experienced love-related misfortunes of an impressively targeted character, which suggests that either the divine retribution system was extremely efficient, or that ancient storytellers had a sharp eye for narrative justice. The sea itself, all around the island, was considered the goddess's element in a way that went beyond the metaphorical. Sailors who departed from Cypriot ports made offerings to Aphrodite for safe passage, not to Poseidon, who was the canonical god of the sea, but to the goddess who was born from it. This seems theologically irregular until you understand that what sailors were asking for was not just calm water and favourable winds, but the specific protection of a deity who had come from the sea and returned to it annually in ritual, who understood the sea's character from the inside in a way that even Poseidon, who ruled it by divine right, could not quite claim. He had authority over the sea. She had intimacy with it. There is a difference, and ancient mariners understood the difference at a practical level. The island's position as a spiritual centre also had significant political dimensions that are easy to overlook if you approach Cypriot religious history purely from the mythology angle. Various powers that controlled Cyprus at different periods, the Assyrians in the 7th century BCE, the Persians, the Ptolemaic Egyptians after Alexander's conquests, and eventually the Romans, each incorporated the Cypriot Aphrodite cult into their own religious frameworks rather than attempting to suppress or replace it. The Ptolemies were particularly enthusiastic about this. They identified Aphrodite with the Egyptian Hathor in ways that created a genuinely syncretic theological tradition, and they sponsored the sanctuary at Paphos with considerable generosity, because associating themselves with the most important love goddess in the Mediterranean world was simply good politics. The goddess of Cyprus was a diplomatic asset. The Romans, when they arrived, did something even more revealing. They identified Cyprus so completely with Venus, their own version of Aphrodite, that the island effectively became the mythological homeland of the Roman deity as well. Considering that Roman mythology placed Venus's primary connections in Italy, this represents a remarkable willingness to defer to an older tradition. The Cypriot sacred geography was too established, too ancient, and too widely accepted to be relocated or overwritten. It was simply adopted. The island remained what it had always been, the place where the goddess was most at home, regardless of which empire happened to be holding the administrative paperwork at any given moment. What makes the Cypriot tradition particularly fascinating is the way it managed to be simultaneously local and universal. The goddess was deeply, specifically Cypriot. The rocks were Cypriot rocks. The groves were Cypriot groves. The stone in the sanctuary was a Cypriot stone that had been anointed with Cypriot olive oil for centuries. And at the same time, she was the goddess of love, which meant that everyone everywhere had a personal stake in her. You didn't need to be Cypriot to have reason to seek her favour. You didn't need to share the island's particular history or speak its language to feel that the sanctuary at Paphos was somehow yours, because the force she represented was already operating inside you whether you had asked it to or not. This combination, a specific sacred place that everyone in the Mediterranean had reason to claim as their own, is what made Cyprus unique among ancient sacred sites. Delphi was the oracle of Apollo, but not everyone needed prophetic guidance with the same urgency. Olympia was sacred to Zeus, but Zeus was the king of the gods, which meant that approaching him required a certain formality and an awareness that you were dealing with the top of the administrative hierarchy. Aphrodite was different. Aphrodite was the deity whose jurisdiction was already active in your life before you had decided whether or not to believe in her. Coming to Cyprus to honour her was, in a sense, simply acknowledging a relationship that already existed. Now, given everything we've established about where Aphrodite came from and how she settled into the world, arriving fully formed from the sea, landing on an island at the crossroads of civilizations, being welcomed into a divine order that immediately found itself reorganized around her, it becomes necessary to ask the more specific and more interesting question: how exactly did she do what she did? Because the worship was real, the fear was real. The ancient world's relationship with Aphrodite was not merely reverent, it was genuinely cautious, in the way that you are cautious around something that has the capacity to significantly disrupt your plans, and that level of caution, applied to a goddess of love rather than, say, a god of storms or a deity of pestilence, suggests that the Greeks understood her power as something considerably more consequential than the ability to make people feel warm feelings about each other. The Greek word that is usually translated as love in the context of Aphrodite is eros, and translating it as love immediately loses about half of what the word actually means. Eros in the ancient Greek understanding was not primarily an emotion, it was a force, an active, external, cosmological force that operated on beings from outside rather than arising from within them. When you felt eros, the ancient understanding was not that you were experiencing a response to something about the other person. It was that you were being acted upon by a power that had entered you the way an arrow enters a body. You were a target, not a subject. The experience happened to you. You did not generate it. This distinction, eros as something that happens to you versus eros as something you feel, has enormous implications for how the ancients understood Aphrodite's power. She was not a goddess who encouraged people to feel loving emotions. She was a goddess who deployed a force that reorganized people's inner lives without their consent. The bow and arrows associated with her son Eros were not a cute metaphor. They were a reasonably accurate description of the phenomenology. Something comes at you, it strikes you, and afterward you are different. You want something you did not want before. You see someone you have seen 100 times and suddenly they are the only thing in the room. The arrow model captures something real about how desire actually feels when it arrives, which is why it has remained the dominant visual metaphor for romantic love for several thousand years and shows no signs of retiring. But Aphrodite's power went deeper than even the arrows could represent, and this is where the ancient theological understanding becomes genuinely sophisticated in ways that tend to get lost in popular retellings. The deeper claim was not just that she could make you want a specific person. The deeper claim was that she could affect your very capacity for desire. your fundamental ability to experience attraction in the first place. She could amplify it, direct it, withhold it, redirect it. She operated not on your conscious choices but on the underlying mechanism of wanting itself. This is why she could be used as a curse as effectively as she could be used as a blessing. A prayer to Aphrodite for success in love was perfectly normal in the ancient world. There is an enormous corpus of surviving tablets, votive offerings, and literary appeals addressed to her in this register, the ancient equivalent of lighting a candle at church. But Aphrodite could also be invoked against someone, to cause them to desire what they should not desire, to want someone who would not want them back, to be consumed by longing that could not be satisfied. This was considered one of the crueler forms of divine punishment available in the Greek theological system, and it was remarkably targeted. You could ask the god of war to make someone's life difficult, and he would oblige with a fairly indiscriminate application of military violence. Asking Aphrodite to make someone's life difficult produced something much more personalized, a suffering that emerged from inside the person, from their own capacity for love turned against their peace of mind, a private torment that looked from the outside like nothing at all. The story of Phaedra is probably the most well-known ancient example of this mechanism at work. Phaedra, the wife of the hero Theseus, developed a consuming desire for her stepson Hippolytus, a young man who had devoted himself entirely to the goddess Artemis, and had, perhaps unwisely, expressed some fairly dismissive views about Aphrodite and the importance of love in a well-ordered life. Aphrodite's response to this dismissal was not to argue the point or send a strongly worded divine memo. She caused Phaedra to want Hippolytus with an intensity that destroyed everyone in the vicinity, including Phaedra herself, including Hippolytus, and including Theseus, who was caught in the middle of a situation he had not asked to be involved in. The goddess did not do this with violence. She did not appear dramatically. She simply adjusted the mechanism of desire inside a single person, and the consequences unfolded from there with the remorseless logic of a very slow avalanche. Euripides wrote a play about this story, his Hippolytus, which survives and remains one of the bleakest things in the theatrical canon, which is saying something given the competition. And the opening of the play features Aphrodite herself explaining exactly what she's about to do and why. She's remarkably matter-of-fact about it. Hippolytus failed to honour her. This is an error with consequences. She's not angry in any hot emotional sense. She's simply making an adjustment. This deity as dispassionate corrective force is more disturbing than any amount of divine rage would be, because rage at least implies that you matter to the one who is angry with you. Aphrodite's mild indifference to Hippolytus as a person, while arranging his destruction, suggests that his suffering is entirely incidental to the process of restoring proper cosmic order. He is not a person to her in this frame. He is a variable in a system that needs to be balanced. This helps explain why the ancient world's relationship with Aphrodite had such a strong element of fear alongside the devotion. You could negotiate with an angry deity, potentially. You could explain yourself, make amends, demonstrate that you understood your error and intended to correct it. The gods of war and storm operated on a model where if you were sufficiently brave, or sufficiently devout, or sufficiently useful, you might earn a measure of their protection, or at least their indifference. Aphrodite's domain was not like this, because the thing she controlled, your own capacity for desire, was not something you could separately appeal to her about using your rational mind. The rational mind was exactly the part of you she could bypass. Homer understood this with particular clarity, and he distributed the understanding across several of the Iliad's most memorable passages. When Hera, the queen of the gods, Zeus's own wife, and a figure of considerable divine authority, wants to distract Zeus from the fighting at Troy, she borrows Aphrodite's girdle. The girdle is one of the most interesting objects in the Homeric theological inventory. It is described as containing love, desire, seductive speech, and all the powers of persuasion that make people forget what they intended to do and think only about what they immediately want. Hera uses it to make Zeus fall for her all over again, immediately, completely, forgetting his plans, forgetting the war, forgetting everything except her. The fact that Hera, who is not exactly a goddess known for vulnerability or weakness, needs to borrow the girdle rather than simply deploying her own authority suggests that Aphrodite's specific power, the power over the mechanism of wanting, was not something that even the Queen of Olympus had access to through ordinary divine channels, It was a specialized instrument. You had to go to the right workshop for it. The episode also reveals something about the social dynamics of Olympus that is easy to miss if you're reading the Iliad primarily as a war narrative. Hera comes to Aphrodite and asks to borrow the girdle. Aphrodite gives it to her without significant resistance. She is, after all, the goddess of love, and helping someone reconnect with their spouse is well within her portfolio. But the transaction establishes something important about the relative positions of the two goddesses. Hera has more formal authority, more institutional power, the entire weight of her status as Zeus's wife and the Queen of Heaven. Aphrodite has the girdle, which in the moment that matters turns out to be considerably more useful. Institutional authority and the capacity to make someone want you are not the same resource, and the Iliad is very clear about which one tends to win in a direct contest. What is perhaps most revealing about the mechanics of Aphrodite's power is the ancient theological consensus that it was not possible to be immune to it through personal virtue or strength of character. This is a significant departure from the way most divine powers worked in the Greek system. You could resist Ares through courage, you could resist the temptations of various lesser deities through wisdom or self-discipline. But Eros, Aphrodite's particular jurisdiction, was not something you could simply decide not to be affected by. Even the gods could not do this. Zeus fell. Poseidon fell. Ares, who was strong enough to make the other gods physically uncomfortable in combat, fell and kept falling, enthusiastically and repeatedly. The only divine figures who were consistently depicted as genuinely exempt from Aphrodite's influence were Athena, Artemis and Hestia, and this exemption was not presented as a victory over Aphrodite so much as a specific divine constitution that simply did not include the relevant mechanism in the first place. They were not resisting desire, they were built without it, which is a different thing entirely and not available as an option for ordinary mortals. Hippolytus tried to be Aphrodite-proof through devotion to Artemis, and principled contempt for everything Aphrodite represented. The play named after him is, among other things, a careful theological argument for why this does not work. The argument is not that Hippolytus was weak, or that his principles were false. His principles were genuine, his devotion to Artemis was real, his contempt for what he saw as the disorder of erotic life was philosophically coherent. None of this mattered, because the capacity for desire is not something you can simply opt out of by deciding to prefer something else. You can choose not to act on it, you can choose not to worship at the relevant altar, but neglecting the altar does not mean the altar stops existing, or that the goddess stops tracking the accounts. The ancients had a concept for this that translates roughly as due worship, the idea that each deity was owed a specific form of acknowledgement appropriate to their domain, and that withholding this acknowledgement was not piety but its opposite. Refusing to honour Aphrodite was not a position of moral superiority. It was an act of impiety toward a legitimate cosmic power, and it had the predictable consequences of any act of impiety in the ancient system. The mistake Hippolytus made was not loving the wrong thing. It was failing to acknowledge that the force he was ignoring had a legitimate claim on his attention. The universe, in the Greek view, did not particularly reward people for pretending that parts of it did not exist. This theological framework had practical implications for how ordinary people in the ancient world navigated their relationship with Aphrodite. They did not primarily approach her as a vending machine for romantic outcomes, though that aspect of the cult was certainly present, and the votive offerings requesting divine assistance in matters of the heart are too numerous to be dismissed. They approached her as a power that needed to be kept in a proper relationship, honoured appropriately, neither neglected nor overemphasized. Too much attention to Aphrodite, letting desire become the organizing principle of your entire existence, was understood to be as dangerous as too little. The poets and playwrights are full of people who gave Eros too much space in their lives and found that it expanded to fill every available room and then started taking structural walls down. The ideal relationship with Aphrodite, as the Greeks seem to have understood it, was something like the ideal relationship with fire: necessary, useful, genuinely important to the quality of life, and entirely capable of burning the house down if you stopped paying attention to it. You honour fire by maintaining it properly, feeding it when it needs feeding, containing it when it needs containing, and never making the mistake of thinking that because you have been successfully managing it for years, you have somehow made it domesticated. It is not domesticated. It is fire. You are managing it. These are different situations. The goddess's animals and sacred plants reinforced this understanding in the visual and sensory vocabulary of ancient cult. The dove, associated with her everywhere in the Mediterranean world, was a creature of dual character: peaceful, gentle, associated with home and safety and the ordinary sweetness of life, but also capable of being suddenly and completely redirected by mating season into a creature that ignores everything except its immediate biological objective. This is a fairly accurate portrait of what Eros does to people. The myrtle tree, whose small white flowers have an intensely sweet scent, and whose berries were used in perfumes and wedding garlands, was sacred to her, partly because it bloomed in late spring, the season of desire, and partly because the myrtle's scent had the specific quality of being pleasant at a distance but overwhelming up close, which again maps well onto the phenomenology of attraction. The rose, particularly the red rose, is associated with her most strongly in later traditions, but the ancient connection is genuine. The rose had thorns, which, in the iconographic logic of antiquity, made it an appropriate symbol for a pleasure that comes with built-in warning, and its beauty was considered the kind of beauty that demands attention even from people who would prefer not to be distracted. The ancient world had a specific aesthetic category for things that were so beautiful they were disturbing, a beauty that did not invite the viewer to remain comfortably in control of their own response, but instead reorganized the viewer's relationship to everything else in the field of perception. Aphrodite's rose was this kind of beauty. The implications of her power for the social world were deeply understood by ancient philosophers and poets, even when they found them troubling. Sappho, the lyric poet from Lesbos whose fragments survive in pieces that are often more affecting for what is missing than for what remains, wrote about Aphrodite with an unusual intimacy, addressing her directly as if they were in personal correspondence rather than in the conventional relationship of mortal worshipper and elevated deity. In one of her most complete surviving poems, she calls on Aphrodite to help her with a love problem, and the goddess responds by appearing in person and asking, with what sounds very much like amused impatience, "What is the matter this time?" The casualness of the tone is remarkable in a genre usually given to formal elevation. Sappho's Aphrodite is less a figure of cosmic terror and more a divine friend who happens to have capabilities you occasionally need and who is gently exasperated by the fact that you keep needing them. This is a different relationship to divine power than the one you find in most ancient religious literature, and it reveals something important about the range of ways in which Aphrodite's power could be understood and approached. The terror was real. The Phaedra story, the Hippolytus story, the dozen other myths about people destroyed by desires they did not ask for and could not control, are all real parts of her mythology. But so was the intimacy. So was the possibility of a relationship with the goddess of desire that was ongoing, personal, and characterized by something that looks very much like mutual understanding. Sappho seems to have achieved this, or at least to have imagined it so vividly that the imagining reads as real. She approaches the goddess not as a supplicant before a power that might at any moment decide to destroy her, but as someone who has been in regular contact long enough to have a sense of the other party's personality. The goddess, in Sappho's rendering, has a personality. She is powerful, and she is ancient, and she is genuinely capable of disrupting your life entirely if she chooses to, but she is also someone you can talk to, someone who arrives when called, someone who has her own sense of humor about the situations that human desire creates. This double quality, cosmic force and personal presence simultaneously, is perhaps the most accurate single description of what Aphrodite's power was understood to be. She was not the abstraction of love in the sense of a principle that operates without will or character. She was the personification of love in the sense of a conscious being who chose to deploy that power, who had preferences about how it was honored, and who responded to the relationships cultivated by her worshippers in ways that were, while not predictable, at least comprehensible. She was not primarily a goddess you feared because she might hurt you, though she might. She was primarily a goddess you feared because she was already inside the experience of being human in a way that no other divine power was. Every other god governed something external: the sea, the war, the harvest, the craft. Aphrodite governed something that was already operating inside you, that had been operating since before you had language to describe it, that would continue operating regardless of your theological positions on the subject. That is a very specific kind of power, and it explains, as neatly as anything can, why the ancient world found it easier to honor her well than to pretend she was not there. Understanding why the marriage happened at all requires a brief detour into the management philosophy of Zeus, which is best described as pragmatic to a fault. Zeus ran Olympus the way a particularly confident executive runs a company that grew too fast, through a combination of genuine authority, strategic favoritism, and a remarkable willingness to make consequential decisions on behalf of people who were not consulted and would not have agreed had they been. He was not a tyrant in the crude sense. He had genuine reasons for most of what he did. And the reasons usually made sense from a certain altitude. The problem was that Zeus consistently operated from an altitude at which individual emotional realities became invisible, and this had a tendency to produce arrangements that were technically functional and humanly catastrophic. He was very good at solving the problems he could see, and completely untroubled by the ones he couldn't. The marriage of Aphrodite and Hephaestus was one of these arrangements. It had administrative logic. It had precedent. It fit neatly into the way Zeus organized the Olympian household, which was less like a divine family and more like a collection of strategic alliances held together by the shared understanding that causing Zeus a serious problem would result in consequences nobody wanted. Seen from a sufficiently high vantage point, Zeus's vantage point conveniently enough, pairing the goddess of beauty and desire with the god of craft and fire made a kind of symmetrical sense. Creation and the beauty of what is created, the forge and the finished object, the heat of the furnace and the gleam of the thing that emerges from it. As a piece of divine iconography, it was almost elegant. As a marriage, it was roughly equivalent to pairing a concert pianist with someone who communicates exclusively through elaborate handwritten technical diagrams. They both love music, technically. The diagrams are very accurate. These are not sufficient conditions. The problem was that it was not a piece of iconography. It was a marriage between two actual divine persons with incompatible natures, incompatible needs, and such fundamentally different ways of being in the world that cohabitation required both of them to be something other than what they were, which, in the ancient understanding, was not merely uncomfortable. It was a kind of slow metaphysical damage, the equivalent of asking a river to be a mountain because the administrative paperwork described them both as landscape features, and someone needed to fill the position. Hephaestus deserves more careful attention than he usually gets in popular retellings of this story, where he tends to function mainly as the character whose wife cheats on him, rather than as a figure of genuine interest in his own right. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable beings in the Greek pantheon. He was the divine craftsman, not a craftsman in the diminished modern sense of someone who makes things with their hands as opposed to with their intellect, but a craftsman in the ancient sense in which making things well was considered one of the highest possible expressions of intelligence, precision, and deep understanding of how the world actually works. Hephaestus built the palaces of the gods. He constructed the automata, golden mechanical servants who could walk and think and assist him in the forge, which are possibly the oldest robots in recorded human imagination, and were not described in any way that suggests the Greeks found them less astonishing than we would. He made Achilles' armour, which was not merely protective equipment, but a philosophical statement about heroism hammered into bronze and silver, a work so extraordinary that it gets its own extended description in the Iliad, and functions almost as a character in its own right. He fashioned chains strong enough to hold Prometheus against a mountainside for eternity, which is not a standard contractual requirement, but speaks to the range of his capabilities. He built the first woman, Pandora, out of clay, and gave her a face that caused every deity who looked at it to temporarily forget what they had been thinking about, which is either a supreme artistic achievement or a significant public health concern depending on your perspective. He was, in other words, a creative genius of the first order, and in a different story, or possibly the same story narrated with different priorities, he would have been recognized as one of the most powerful presences on Olympus. His power did not manifest as force or beauty or eloquence, or the easy, confident authority that Zeus and Poseidon carried with them into every room. It manifested as mastery, the deep, thorough, technically complete understanding of how things are made and how they can be unmade and remade differently. The smithy was his domain, and within the smithy he had an authority that nobody disputed, because nobody else could do what he did or even begin to understand the process by which he was doing it. The other gods could watch the result emerge from the forge and be impressed. They could not replicate a single step of what went into it. This is a particular kind of power, the power of being the only person in any room who understands what is actually happening, and it is one that tends to be undervalued until the moment when you suddenly need something built, and realize you have been treating the builder carelessly. This was, as it turned out, not quite the same skill set as being a satisfying husband to the goddess of love. These two qualifications occasionally overlap, but they are not the same qualification, and assuming they are has led to a great deal of confusion throughout human history, not just on Olympus. Being very good at building things, at understanding structures and materials and the elegant engineering of systems that work, does not automatically translate into being good at the fundamentally different, structurally incomprehensible, magnificently inefficient project of being in relationship with another person. The forge has rules. Relationships have tendencies. The distinction is significant. The ancient sources give us glimpses of how Hephaestus understood his marriage, and what they reveal is genuinely poignant rather than simply convenient backstory for the affair that follows. He made things for Aphrodite. This was how he expressed care, because making things was how he expressed everything. He constructed for her devices and adornments of a quality that nothing else in creation could match, not merely beautiful in the superficial sense of attractive to look at, but beautiful in the deeper sense of precisely, ingeniously, perfectly made. Perfectly. The girdle that Homer describes, which contained within it all the forces of desire and persuasion that Aphrodite embodied, was Hephaestus's work. He had taken her nature and encoded it into an object with the thoroughness of a scholar preparing the definitive edition of a text. Mirrors made by methods unknown to any other craftsman. Jewellery that functioned as an argument for what beauty could be when applied by someone who understood materials at a molecular level, centuries before molecules were a concept. Perfumes, according to some traditions, that he had engineered to never run out. An eternal fragrance, technically, which sounds romantic until you consider that the ability to produce infinite perfume was his way of solving the problem of her needs, rather than sitting with her in the garden and letting the actual flowers do the work. This is the texture of the incompatibility. He could give her anything except the quality of being fully present to her. He could give her objects that embodied his full attention. He could not give her his full attention in person, because his attention was organized differently. It moved through the mediation of making, through the translation of feeling into form, through the forge's logic of intention meeting material. He thought in projects. She needed encounters. He communicated through things he made. She communicated through the charged space between people. He was, in the most complete sense, a maker. She was, in the most complete sense, a relator. Both of these are valuable and extraordinary ways to be in the world. They are, however, not naturally compatible as the primary languages of a shared domestic life. The political dimensions of the marriage deserve their own examination because they tend to be either ignored entirely or mentioned so briefly that their significance doesn't land. Marriage in the ancient Greek world, at every social level, from the most ordinary Athenian household to the great dynastic houses, was fundamentally an alliance structure. It connected families, consolidated resources, established mutual obligations, and created a network of relationships with practical consequences extending far beyond the two individuals most directly involved. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a political instrument, and the feelings of the parties being married were not typically the primary variable in determining whether the match was made. The primary variable was whether the match served the interests of the parties doing the making. Among the gods, this logic operated with even more concentrated force. Because the alliances being constructed were between powers whose cooperation or conflict had consequences that extended to the entire order of things. A bad marriage between two ordinary Athenians produced unhappy people and complicated inheritance situations. A bad marriage on Olympus had the potential to destabilize the entire divine administration, as Hephaestus had already demonstrated by trapping Hera in the golden chair, a piece of furniture that functioned as a rather pointed reminder that the god of the forge could make a prison out of a gift when the occasion called for it, and that people who had dismissed him had perhaps not fully thought through the implications of dismissing someone whose skill extended to elegant entrapment. Zeus's decision to marry Aphrodite to Hephaestus was, in this context, a piece of political engineering with multiple simultaneous objectives. Hephaestus had a complicated relationship with the Olympian household. In one tradition, he had been thrown from the heights of heaven by Zeus in a moment of divine irritability. In another, he had been cast out at birth by Hera, who found him insufficiently beautiful for a son of hers, which is an objection that manages to be both shallow and cosmically ironic, given that she was discarding the most skilled maker in the history of existence. Either version produces the same result. a god of enormous power who had personal reason to feel aggrieved about his treatment, who operated somewhat at the margins of the Olympian social hierarchy, and who had already demonstrated, with the golden chair, that when he felt wronged he expressed it through craft rather than violence, producing consequences that were difficult to reverse without his cooperation. The chair could only be unseated by the maker. Hera sat in it until Hephaestus decided she'd sat long enough. This is, as political demonstrations go, extremely effective, and Zeus was paying attention. Giving him Aphrodite was compensation of a spectacular and nearly unanswerable kind, the most desired deity in the pantheon, offered to the god who had reason to feel that the pantheon owed him a substantial debt. It addressed Hephaestus's legitimate grievances with a gift that was extremely difficult to argue with publicly, because arguing with it would have required Hephaestus to say, out loud, in front of everyone, that what he actually wanted was acknowledgement and respect and the sense of being a genuine member of the family, rather than a tolerated peripheral figure, and that a beautiful wife was not the same thing, and he could see the difference. This was a position that was both entirely true and socially impossible to maintain in the context of a gift that the entire Olympian assembly was watching him receive. Zeus understood this. Gift-giving as a political maneuver works precisely because it creates a situation where declining or critiquing the gift costs the recipient more than accepting it under terms they did not agree to. It is a very old technique and it remains in continuous use. From Aphrodite's perspective, a perspective that the ancient sources treat with varying degrees of sympathy, from quote 13 to quote 14, depending on the author and the century, the arrangement was simply a fact of divine life that she had not been invited to participate in designing. She had no more chosen Hephaestus than the daughter of any Greek citizen of the classical period had typically chosen her husband. The match was made by those with the authority to make it, and the parties most directly affected were informed rather than consulted. That this should be the precise situation of the goddess of love is the kind of paradox that ancient cultures seem to find dramatically interesting rather than politically troubling, which tells you something about ancient cultures that it is worth sitting with for a moment. The woman who embodied the power of desire, placed in a situation where her own desires were structurally irrelevant to the terms of her domestic arrangement. The goddess who represented the force that reorganizes people's lives from the inside, made subject to an arrangement imposed from the outside. Ancient authors did not generally pause to note the irony. The irony was just the situation, and the situation was normal enough that it did not require comment. What it did require, eventually, was consequences, and the mythology was thorough about delivering them. The honeymoon period of the marriage, if there was one, receives no mythological coverage whatsoever, which probably tells you everything you need to know about how the ancient oral tradition assessed its entertainment value. What the mythology does record is the household that Hephaestus constructed around Aphrodite, which is itself a small but telling detail. He constructed it. It was his project. He built a world for them to live in and invited her into it, rather than building something in dialogue with her. This is not malicious. It is completely characteristic of how he operated. A space designed by Hephaestus was going to be extraordinary, deliberately proportioned, precisely engineered, every element chosen and placed according to a comprehensive understanding of how light and material and space create an environment. It was going to be the best possible version of a space. It was going to be his vision, flawlessly executed rather than something that emerged from a conversation between two people about how they wanted to live. Living inside someone else's vision of the ideal life is a particular experience. Even when the vision is genuinely excellent, even when the person who designed it had real insight and real talent and was trying, in their way, to create something beautiful, there is a quality of displacement in it that accumulates over time. The objects are all right. The light is all right. Everything works the way it was designed to work, and somehow the space does not feel inhabited so much as maintained. Hephaestus's household for Aphrodite was the physical expression of everything he understood about her, translated into architectural form, which is different from a home built through the accumulated negotiations of two people learning to live together, and the difference shows in ways that are difficult to name but easy to feel. The forge itself was somewhere else, underground in some traditions, or on a sacred island, or simply in a dimension of heat and precision that was fundamentally incompatible with the sensory world that Aphrodite inhabited. He spent most of his time there. This is where he was most himself, most capable, most fully in possession of his powers. The forge was not where he brought his problems to think them over. It was where his problems ceased to be problems, because in the forge the rules were clear and his mastery was complete, and the things he made did exactly what he had designed them to do. The forge was where Hephaestus went to be unconfused in a life that otherwise offered him significant opportunities for confusion, and Aphrodite was, from his perspective, an ongoing opportunity for confusion of a high order. She operated by rules he could not quite follow, in a register he was not equipped to match, through a mode of existence that required precisely the things he was least able to give. He was not indifferent to her. Indifference would have been simpler. He was attentive in his way. The gifts demonstrate this. The quality of making that went into them demonstrates this. The sheer volume of beautiful things he produced for her demonstrates this. He was just attentive in the wrong language, consistently, for a long time, and languages are very difficult to learn when you have been thinking in a different one your whole life. The spiritual dimension of what he made for her is worth examining, because it reveals something about what the ancients understood craft to be, and what it was understood to be missing. The objects Hephaestus created were not merely beautiful things that served practical or decorative functions. They were in some sense animated by the intelligence and attention that had produced them, carrying within their structure the evidence of a care so precise and complete that the objects themselves constituted a form of communication. When he made the girdle, he was encoding her nature into a physical form he could understand, translating the force of desire into something with dimensions and weight, something that could be held and examined and analysed. This was his version of intimacy. He understood her well enough to reproduce the effects of her power in woven gold, and something that ancient authors struggle to describe, because it was not quite any material that existed independently of his making it. The tragedy is that reproducing the effects of someone's nature is not the same thing as encountering that nature. You can produce a technically perfect recording of a piece of music, and still miss everything that made the performance matter. You can understand someone thoroughly, their history, their needs, their way of moving through the world, and still not be able to meet them there, in the specific place where they live, in the specific register they need. Hephaestus knew what Aphrodite's girdle could do. He did not know what it was like to be the person whose nature the girdle had been translated from. These are two different kinds of knowledge, and only one of them is available from inside the forge. The question the mythology implicitly poses, and never quite answers because it is the kind of question mythology prefers to leave open, is whether this incompatibility was anyone's failure in the moral sense, or simply the predictable consequence of joining two divine natures that were genuinely structurally incongruent. Ancient authors tend toward assigning blame to Aphrodite, whose response to the marriage was to find elsewhere what she could not find at home, which is a less flattering framing than ___quote__15__, but serves the narrative purposes of setting up a story with a clear wrongdoer. The wrongdoer frame is dramatically satisfying. It is also an interesting evasion of the more uncomfortable observation that a goddess whose fundamental nature requires passion and encounter and mutual presence, placed in a domestic arrangement that could provide everything except passion and encounter and mutual presence, was being asked to be something other than what she was, and that this request was made not by Hephaestus, who had his own nature and could not be otherwise than he was, but by Zeus, who made the arrangement with the cheerful indifference of a person solving an administrative problem who has chosen not to think of the people involved as people. The marriage also produced, somewhat ironically, some of the most beautiful objects in the mythology. Every extraordinary thing Hephaestus made during the period of the marriage was animated in part by the particular intensity that comes from a creative person whose emotional life is not being adequately addressed, and who therefore pours everything into the work. The forge in this period would have been at its most productive. The objects emerging from it would have had a quality of concentrated attention that bordered on the obsessive. This is not an unusual dynamic. The history of art is substantially a history of people whose personal lives were complicated, producing extraordinary things, which suggests either that suffering is productive or that very focused people tend to produce both. But it has a specific quality when the work in question involves making beautiful things for the person who is the cause of the complication. Every gift he made her was also, in some sense, an attempt to solve the problem through skill, and skill is very good at many things, but it cannot solve the problem of two people being fundamentally, structurally incompatible. The forge continued producing. The marriage continued existing in the formal sense. and somewhere in the space between the extraordinary objects and the inadequate conversation, in the particular silences of a household where one person works alone and the other finds the silence increasingly unbearable, the conditions were being assembled for a different story entirely. It is worth pausing here to consider what an incompatible divine marriage actually looked like in practical terms. Because the mythology tends to skip from quote, _16 to quote, 17 as if the intervening period were simply a bureaucratic waiting room, rather than a significant stretch of lived experience. Divine marriages were not symbolic. The gods, in the Greek understanding, experienced time and daily life in ways that were qualitatively similar to mortal experience, even if the scale and stakes were different. They had moods, they had preferred environments, they had things they wanted to be doing and things they were avoiding. The daily texture of their lives was as real as the dramatic events that the mythology chose to record. The texture of the Hephaestus and Aphrodite household, as it can be reconstructed from the edges of various ancient accounts, had a particular quality that anyone who has ever been in a significantly mismatched domestic situation will recognize immediately. It was not obviously terrible. There was no open conflict, because Hephaestus was not a person who dealt in open conflict. His responses to grievance were oblique, methodical, delayed, and delivered through the medium of something he had made, rather than through direct confrontation. There was no sustained coldness, because he was not cold. He cared, in his way, and the caring showed up consistently in the form of objects and caretaking of a material kind, of a household that functioned perfectly and was supplied with everything that could be supplied through craftsmanship. And there was no clear moment where either of them could point at something specific and say, "There, that is the problem. That particular identifiable thing is what is wrong." What there was instead was a kind of persistent mild wrongness, a low-grade unease that comes from being in an environment that has everything except the specific thing you most need, and from knowing, at some level below the one where you can put words to it, that the person across the room is genuinely trying, and that their genuine trying simply does not reach you in the form you need to be reached. This is a hard kind of unhappiness to address because it offers no clear grievance to work with. You cannot say, "You are unkind to me." You cannot say, "You have failed me in this specific measurable way." What you can only say is, "Something essential is missing, and I don't know how to explain what it is to someone for whom it is not missing, and I don't think they would understand me if I tried." Aphrodite, being the goddess of desire and all of its attendant emotional complexity, probably had a richer vocabulary for this experience than most beings in her position would have had. She understood, at the level of her divine nature, exactly what was happening. The absence of encounter, the specific quality of not being met. She understood it the way a musician understands when they are out of tune, not through intellectual analysis but through direct, unmediated perception of the wrongness of the thing. Whether she found this understanding useful is a separate question. Understanding a problem with great precision does not automatically provide the tools to solve it, and the precision of Aphrodite's understanding may have made the situation sharper, rather than easier to bear. The social world of Olympus, meanwhile, was not a contained or private environment. The gods occupied a shared world with shared spaces and constant mutual awareness, and a marriage between two of them was not an entirely private arrangement. The other Olympians knew the household. They observed it. They drew their own conclusions, with the casual thoroughness of a community that has no strong tradition of minding its own business. Apollo composed verses about things. Hermes noticed everything and commented on most of it. Hera, who had her own extensive experience of difficult marriages at the highest institutional level, may or may not have had opinions about how the situation was being managed. The household of Hephaestus and Aphrodite was not being conducted in a vacuum, and whatever private suffering it contained was surrounded on all sides by the cheerful, gossip-prone attention of the extended Olympian family. This is worth noting because it adds a dimension of social pressure to a situation that was already difficult enough on its own internal terms. Aphrodite was the goddess of desire, which meant that every other divine person's feelings about her were complicated by the nature of her power. Being desired by essentially everyone in any room you enter is not, as it might sound to a mortal observer, an uncomplicated advantage. It means that almost nobody in your vicinity is perceiving you with full clarity, because their perception is being coloured by the force you embody. It means that relationships you might want to be straightforward are perpetually complicated by the overlay of desire on top of whatever else might have been possible. And it means that a marriage which does not provide emotional fulfillment is surrounded by people who are, structurally, not entirely capable of being neutral about your availability, which creates its own kind of pressure that is different from what a mortal woman in an unhappy marriage would have experienced. The ancient world's moral calculus regarding Aphrodite's response to this situation was, as previously noted, not particularly generous to her. The assumption built into most ancient treatments is that the appropriate response to an unsatisfying arranged marriage was patient endurance, and that departing from patient endurance was a moral failure of a specifically feminine kind. This assumption tells you a great deal about the ancient world and relatively little about Aphrodite, who was not, in any reading of her mythology, a deity distinguished by her investment in patient endurance. She was the goddess of desire. Patient endurance of unfulfilled desire was not among her primary characteristics, and expecting it of her was roughly equivalent to expecting the god of war to solve his problems through peaceful negotiation. It was not impossible in principle, it was just not what the nature of the thing inclined toward. What the ancient sources do agree on, even when they present the events with varying degrees of moral sympathy, is that the marriage to Hephaestus did not change what Aphrodite was. This sounds obvious, but it is actually a significant theological statement. One of the implicit functions of marriage in the ancient world was normative. Marriage was understood to settle people, to domesticate energies that were previously uncontained, to channel what had been free-flowing into the more structured forms that social life required. This was as true for divine marriages as for mortal ones. The expectation embedded in the arrangement was that the goddess of desire would become, by virtue of being married, a goddess of desire who was also married, and that these two descriptions would modify each other in the direction of stability. They did not, or rather, they modified each other in the direction of instability, which is the other possible outcome when you attempt to domesticate something whose nature is fundamentally incompatible with domestication. The marriage did not settle Aphrodite. It clarified her. It made more visible, by providing a structural contrast, exactly what she was and what she was not. She was not a being who could be satisfied by institutional arrangements that did not correspond to genuine emotional reality, and she was particularly not a being who could be satisfied by the specific combination of material generosity and emotional absence that Hephaestus, through no malice and some genuine care, provided. This clarification had consequences that were, depending on your perspective, either the inevitable unfolding of a situation that was never going to resolve otherwise, or a story about moral failure in which the wrong party tends to get the most sympathy from modern audiences who have had time to think about who was actually responsible for the original situation. Both readings are available in the Mythology, and the Mythology does not resolve them. It simply contains both, the way the marriage itself contained both genuine care and fundamental incompatibility, and leaves the reader to sit with the discomfort of a situation where nobody is entirely right and nobody is entirely without responsibility, and the person with the most structural power over the whole arrangement, Zeus, who made the match, is the one least likely to be held accountable for how it went. The objects Hephaestus made for Aphrodite did not go away when the marriage began to unravel in private, if not in form. This is one of the aspects of the mythology that receives less attention than it probably deserves. The way his gifts outlasted the relationship that motivated them. The girdle went on being the girdle, containing the forces of desire and persuasion that it had always contained, available to be borrowed and used by Hera in the Iliad, with spectacular effectiveness centuries after its making. The jewellery went on being extraordinary. The objects persisted with the indifference of well-made things to the emotional circumstances that surrounded their creation, which is either consoling or deeply impersonal depending on how you look at it. A poem outlives the love that wrote it. A house outlives the family that built it. The forge produces things that remain after the forge goes cold, and the maker has turned his attention elsewhere. There is a particular irony, visible only at a certain angle, in the fact that the most lasting expression of Hephaestus's care for Aphrodite was a girdle that encoded her power to make other people desire each other, that his greatest act of devotion toward her was a masterwork about her effect on everyone except himself. The girdle demonstrated his understanding of what she was, his ability to analyze and reproduce the mechanics of desire in physical form. It could not demonstrate that he desired her in the way she needed to be desired. because that kind of desire is not something you can demonstrate through craft. It lives only in real time, in real presence, in the specific unguarded attention that one conscious being pays to another in a moment that is not planned or engineered or produced through skill. Hephaestus could make anything except this moment, and this moment was what the marriage most needed. There is one further dimension worth examining before the story moves into its more dramatic phase: the question of what the marriage looked like from the outside to mortal observers and to the broader Greek world that was constructing its understanding of divine life through these stories. The marriage of Aphrodite and Hephaestus was not simply a private divine arrangement. It was a mythological image that people used to understand something about how the world worked, about what forces operated in it, and how they related to each other. The image it presented was deeply ambivalent. On one level, it could be read as a story about the proper ordering of things, beauty and craft joined, desire and making in alliance. This reading was available and some ancient authors took it, finding in the marriage a kind of cosmological symmetry that satisfied the desire for things to be arranged sensibly. On another level, visible to anyone who paid attention to the details rather than the headline, it was a story about what happens when you try to organize the forces of the world according to administrative convenience rather than actual compatibility, when you decide that beauty belongs with craft because it sounds right in a diagram, and ignore the possibility that beauty and craft might have fundamentally different requirements as ways of being alive. The Greeks were, generally speaking, very good at holding both of these readings simultaneously without forcing a resolution. Their mythology is full of arrangements that are both theoretically correct and practically disastrous, both sanctioned by divine authority and personally catastrophic for the individuals involved, both necessary for the maintenance of cosmic order and deeply unfair to specific people who did not ask to be the material through which cosmic order maintained itself. This is not confusion or contradiction on the mythology's part. It is a fairly sophisticated understanding of how institutions and individuals interact, how the requirements of the larger order are often in genuine tension with the requirements of individual flourishing, and how these tensions do not resolve cleanly into someone being right and someone being wrong, but instead persist as the basic condition of social life at any scale. The marriage of Hephaestus and Aphrodite was, in this reading, a small-scale model of a much larger truth, that the world is organized by forces that have no particular investment in the happiness of the specific people through whom they operate, and that this is not a malfunction, it is the design. The comfort, such as it is, lies in the observation that the people going through it are not uniquely unfortunate. They are participants in a pattern that is as old as the organization of divine authority, as old as the decision to pair sky with earth and craft with beauty and fire with water, and all the other structural pairings through which the world was made coherent at the cost of making it. For many of the beings within it, a place where what you are and what you're required to be are not always the same thing. The story does not end with this observation. It ends with a net. But understanding the quality of the silence that preceded the net, the long, well-furnished, impeccably crafted silence of a marriage between two remarkable beings who could not find each other, is what makes the net mean something beyond the surface drama. The net is the response of a craftsman who has run out of other options. It is the final product of a forge that has been working through grief in the only language it knows, making something that will do precisely what it is designed to do, without ambiguity, without compromise, without the complicated inefficiency of actually trying to resolve something through conversation. He built the trap because he could not fix what was wrong, and because building was what he did with things that could not be fixed. And somewhere across Olympus, in a space that was everything the forge was not, warm and uncontrolled and organized by pleasure rather than precision, the situation that would require the net was already in progress, entirely unaware that the metalwork had already begun. Because the one thing Hephaestus was never short of was patience, and the one thing he had always been extraordinarily good at was designing systems that performed exactly the function he had intended, at exactly the moment he had planned, without any possibility of the targets understanding what was happening until they were already inside it. The forge was going to produce one more extraordinary object, and this one, for the first time in a long career of beautiful things, was not going to be a gift. The information arrived, as inconvenient information tends to do, at the worst possible moment, and through the most unavoidable possible source, Helios, the sun god, whose daily passage across the sky gave him an unobstructed view of everything happening on Earth and on Olympus with a thoroughness that no surveillance system in human history has ever quite replicated. Had seen what was happening in the household of Hephaestus. He had seen it with considerable clarity and on multiple occasions because the sun does not have the option of looking away, and because Helios, in most ancient accounts, had the professional habits of someone who has been gathering comprehensive information about the world for a very long time and has not yet decided which pieces of it are his business to share. He was not a gossip in the casual sense, he was a witness. The distinction matters, because witnesses who have seen something tend eventually to feel the weight of what they know, particularly when the person they know it about is someone who has the resources and the temperament to respond in dramatic and lasting ways. So Helios went to Hephaestus. The conversation itself is not recorded in detail by any ancient source, which is either because the details were considered obvious, or because the ancient mythological tradition correctly intuited that the most interesting part of the story was not the information being delivered, but what happened in Hephaestus immediately after receiving it. Whatever Helios said, and the most charitable reading is that he said it with a degree of care appropriate to delivering genuinely difficult news to a person who had just learned something he had probably suspected for some time. The result was a silence of the particular quality that follows the moment when something you have been half aware of becomes something you can no longer pretend not to know. Hephaestus did not rage. This is the detail that ancient authors note with what seems like genuine interest, as if they expected something different and found the actual response more revealing than an outburst would have been. He did not destroy things, which would have been easy given that his workshop was full of objects of extraordinary hardness and solidity. He did not go immediately to confront anyone, which would have been the conventional masculine response in a culture that generally endorsed immediate confrontation as the appropriate reaction to being wronged. He did not appeal to Zeus, which would have been the institutional response, the reporting of a grievance up the divine hierarchy to the authority with the power to adjudicate it. He did none of these things. He went to the forge. And here is where understanding Hephaestus requires setting aside every modern instinct about how grief expresses itself, because the forge was not where he went to escape his feelings. The forge was where he processed them. It was his instrument of thought, his medium of response, the place where he converted whatever was happening inside him into the clearest and most precise external form he was capable of producing. When he was in the forge, he was not avoiding the problem. He was working on it in the only language he had ever fully trusted, which was the language of things that could be made and measured and tested and perfected. What he was working on was revenge, and revenge for Hephaestus was necessarily a craft project. The net he built is one of the great pieces of divine engineering in all of Greek mythology, and it deserves to be described with some of the attention that Hephaestus himself would have given to it, because the object is not simply a plot device, it is a character study. What he made reveals, in extremely precise physical form, exactly how he thought about the situation and what he wanted from its resolution. The net was made of metal. The accounts vary between gold, bronze, and some material that ancient sources describe as finer than either, suggesting a substance whose properties Hephaestus had developed specifically for this application, which is either the sign of a very specialized craftsman or a very motivated one, probably both. The threads were impossibly thin, finer than human hair, finer than spider silk, thinner than any fiber that would be visible in ordinary light, and yet they were stronger than any chain of conventional dimensions. This combination, the fineness and the strength, was not incidental. It was the technical signature of the trap's purpose, to be undetectable until the moment of contact, and then to be absolutely inescapable. There was to be no warning, no period during which the occupants might assess their situation and make a decision about their next move. One moment, ordinary bedroom. Next moment, a perfect prison with no visible walls, assembled around the people inside it before they were aware that it existed. He worked on it at intervals, over a period of time, not compulsively or in a single frantic session, but with the methodical patience of someone who understands that rushed metalwork is bad metalwork, and that bad metalwork would not serve his purposes here. He needed it to be right. He needed the mechanism to be tested. He needed the triggering system, the specific arrangement of threads and anchors that would cause the net to close when the right conditions were met, to be calibrated with a precision that left no room for the net to fail at the wrong moment. He had one opportunity. The forge during this period would have been operating at its highest possible standard because the work had stakes that nothing he had made before quite matched. The palaces of the gods were important. The armor he made for heroes was important. But this was personal, and personal work, for any craftsman who has ever made something that mattered to them, tends to bring out a quality of attention that is different in texture from professional excellence. It is more careful, and also more reckless, more precise, and also more deeply felt, the product of a state of mind that is neither calm nor agitated, but something that partakes of both simultaneously. When the net was finished, he installed it. The installation required access to the room where the meetings were taking place, which he had. It was after all his household. And it required doing the installation without being observed, which was manageable given that the threads were effectively invisible and the anchoring points were integrated into the existing structure of the room so thoroughly that they would not have been distinguishable from ordinary architectural details to any eye that was not already looking for them. A trap of this kind depends entirely on the target having no reason to look carefully at the walls and ceiling of a room they have been using comfortably for some time. People do not typically examine the infrastructure of spaces they feel safe in. This is, on reflection, an entirely reasonable heuristic for ordinary life, and an extremely unfortunate one in the specific circumstances of an Olympian affair. Having installed the trap, Hephaestus did something that the ancient sources treat as either brilliantly calculated or mildly theatrical, depending on how generous you feel toward him at this point in the narrative. He announced, publicly and with some fanfare, that he was leaving Olympus to spend time on the island of Lemnos. He had, he said, business there. He was going. He would be absent. This was the announcement of a man who understood that the mechanism he had set required his absence to function, because the reason the meetings were happening in his household was that he was not in it, and if he was known to be gone, the meetings would continue, and if they continued with the trap in place, the trap would close. He was engineering not just the physical device, but the social conditions that would allow it to operate. He was, in other words, still thinking like a craftsman, treating the problem as a system, identifying the variables, setting up the conditions for the desired outcome with the same methodical precision he applied to every other project. He left, and then, presumably, he sat somewhere on Lemnos in a state of waiting that cannot have been comfortable, but that he was accustomed to, because he had always worked on long time scales, and he understood that the most precisely made things require patience to deliver their effects. He did not have to wait long. The spring that released the net was, by design, sensitive. He had made it that way deliberately, built it to respond to the specific combination of weight and movement that the situation would produce, rather than to any accidental configuration of the room's normal use. The trap was selective in the way that very good traps are selective. It was not designed to catch everyone who entered the room, only the specific people entering the room under specific circumstances. This level of precision is either impressive or slightly unnerving, depending on your perspective, and the ancient authors, Homer in particular, who tells this story with evident enjoyment in the Odyssey, seem to find it both simultaneously, which is probably the appropriate response. When the net fell, it fell completely and at once. This was by design. Not gradually, not in stages that might have given the occupants a moment to assess their situation and attempt a response, but entirely and immediately. Every thread snapping into position, every anchor catching, the whole mechanism activating in a single instant that converted the room from open space to enclosed prison faster than the relevant divine reflexes could process what was happening. The net was invisible even then, in the sense that its individual threads remained too fine to see clearly. What was visible was its effect. Two figures, unable to move, held in exactly the position they had occupied when the mechanism triggered, suspended in a moment that was now going to last significantly longer than they had expected. Hephaestus was informed, how exactly is not specified in most versions, but his network of information, like his network of metal, appears to have been comprehensive, and he came back from Lemnos. He came back loudly. He came back calling on the other gods to come and see what he had found, which is either the behaviour of a man in acute pain who has momentarily lost his judgment, or the behaviour of a man who had planned this exact moment as carefully as he had planned the net, and understood that witnesses were the mechanism by which a private grievance became a public event with public consequences. Probably both. The gods came. This is presented in Homer with a specificity that suggests either excellent mythological memory, or a poet who had a very clear sense of which characters in this scene would be funny, and which would be instructive, and who felt no particular obligation to pass up either opportunity. The male gods came: Poseidon, Apollo, Hermes. The goddesses, Homer notes, stayed away out of modesty, which has been read variously as evidence of divine social norms, Homeric narrative economy, or Homer's decision not to put Hera in a scene that would have generated plot complications entirely unrelated to the main point. The exact composition of the audience is less important than the fact that there was an audience, which was the whole point. And here is where the story reveals its most interesting layer, because what happens at the scene is not what Hephaestus probably imagined. Or rather, it is what he arranged for, but the arrangement produces consequences he did not fully anticipate, because the reactions of the gathered gods are not the reactions of a moral community delivering a clear verdict on a clear offence. They are the reactions of a complicated group of individuals with their own perspectives, interests and senses of humour, responding to a situation that turns out to be considerably more philosophically interesting than a simple scandal. Apollo, according to Homer, turned to Hermes and asked, with the tone of someone posing a genuinely interesting hypothetical, whether he would mind being caught in such a net if the price of the catching were also being in that particular company. It is a casual remark, a deity's offhand observation about desire and dignity, and which of the two ultimately outweighs the other. The answer, which Hermes delivers with the equanimity of a god who has always been honest about his appetites, is that he would not mind at all, that he would happily be visible to all the gods in all their number if that were the condition of being where Ares was at that moment. The gods laugh. This laughter is famous, and it is worth understanding what it represents. It is not laughter at the scandal in the sense of moral censure finding comic expression. It is laughter at the honesty of desire, at the gods recognizing in Hermes' answer something they all understand, at the fundamentally absurd collision between the dignity of divine beings and the undignified completeness of wanting something. Poseidon's response is different in character and reveals something about the social dynamics at work. He examined the net. He assessed the craftsmanship, which, being Poseidon and therefore deeply familiar with divine artisanship of all kinds, he recognized as extraordinary. He then proposed to Hephaestus that the net be released, offering to personally guarantee that Ares would pay whatever restitution was appropriate. He argued the practical case. The prisoners were caught, the point was made, the appropriate response was now to proceed through the established channels of divine law rather than to continue the public display. His concern, visible beneath the practical framing, was probably less with justice than with the spectacle. With the degree to which the prolonged public exposure of two major divine figures in a compromising situation was generating a quality of embarrassment that was, from the perspective of maintaining Olympian dignity, not entirely in anyone's interest. Hephaestus's response to Poseidon's offer was suspicious and specific. He said, essentially, "I do not trust Ares to pay. If you guarantee it and he defaults, you pay." Poseidon agreed. This negotiation is remarkable for the context in which it takes place. Two gods calmly working out the terms of a legal guarantee while two other gods are unable to move 12 feet away, and it reveals something about how the ancient Greeks understood the relationship between emotion and law. The law did not wait for the emotion to resolve before proceeding. The negotiation happened in the room, with the evidence present, in the middle of what should, by any reasonable assessment, have been an overwhelming personal moment for at least one of the participants. Hephaestus was working the deal. He was in pain, and he was working the deal, because working deals was what he did, and because he had the craftsman's understanding that structures, legal structures, financial structures, any structure, were the means by which outcomes that could not be produced through will alone were produced through mechanism. He could not make Ares accountable through feeling. He could make him accountable through Poseidon's guarantee and the established system of divine compensation. He released the net. The lovers were free, and the scandal that had been building in the Olympian social atmosphere for whatever period of time the affair had been ongoing was now public, acknowledged, fully visible to the gods who mattered most to the social standing of everyone involved. It is worth pausing here to consider Ares' side of the story, if only because he tends to function in popular retellings as a convenient symbol. The god of war, beautiful and brutal, everything that Hephaestus was not, rather than as a figure with his own specific qualities that made the affair something more complicated than a simple contrast between fire-scarred craftsman and gleaming warrior. Ares was not attractive to Aphrodite simply because he was physically impressive. He was attractive because his nature was in certain respects the mirror of hers. Where she was the force of drawing together, he was the force of collision. the power that drove beings into violent contact with each other. These are not as different as they appear from a comfortable distance. Both powers operate outside the rational control of the people they affect. Both produce states of intensity that ordinary life cannot sustain. Both have a particular relationship with the body's vulnerability in battle, the body's urgency and desire, that no other divine domain quite matches. The god of war and the goddess of love were, in the ancient understanding, the two forces most likely to make a person forget entirely who they had been the day before, and become someone organized entirely around a single overwhelming present tense reality. This is one of the reasons the affair was not simply a scandal about personal transgression, but a theologically significant pairing that the mythology returned to repeatedly, and that the ancients found simultaneously troubling and inevitable. Two forces that operated by the same basic logic, bypassing reason, acting directly on the body, producing states of total absorption that made everything else temporarily irrelevant, had found each other. The Greeks, who understood the relationship between love and war better than most subsequent civilizations have managed to, found this combination fascinating and not a little terrifying. It is not an accident that the children of Aphrodite and Ares included both harmony and figures associated with the terror that attend both love and battle simultaneously. The pairing produced everything that existed at the intersection of the two most overwhelming human experiences, which is either a complete emotional taxonomy or evidence that the Greeks had a very particular definition of a problematic divine couple, and possibly both at once. What happened next is more interesting than the trap itself, and it is the part of the story that tends to get hurried over in popular retellings. Ares left. He went back to his territory, in most versions Thrace, which is comfortingly far from Olympus and which was essentially his home ground. A place of battles and rough weather, and no significant pressure to account for himself to anyone about anything. His exit was quick. He did not make a speech. He did not engage with the situation on any emotional or moral level that the ancient sources record. He was caught, he was released, and he was gone, which is the behavior of someone who has been embarrassed but not fundamentally challenged, who has the status to absorb the public exposure without any lasting damage to his position. The god of war was caught in a compromising situation, and was out of there before anyone could organize a proper response. He did not, as far as the mythology records, pay the restitution he owed. Whether Poseidon paid it on his behalf, or whether this obligation simply dissolved into the general chaos of subsequent events, is not specified, which is perhaps the mythology's way of observing that Ares' relationship to financial accountability was consistent with his character in all other respects. Aphrodite went to Cyprus. This is the detail in the aftermath that rewards close attention, because it is not simply a geographic note about where she chose to recover from the embarrassment. Cyprus was, as established earlier, her primary sacred site, her oldest home, the place most thoroughly identified with her nature and her power. Going to Cyprus after the exposure on Olympus was not retreating. It was returning to the source of herself, the place where she was most completely what she was, where the framework of Hephaestus's household and Hephaestus's gifts and the administrative fact of their marriage had no presence and no weight. On Cyprus she was born again, in the ritual sense that the annual festival reenacted her emergence from the sea, and the symbolic resonance of her returning there immediately after the most public stripping away of her domestic context suggests either sophisticated mythological symbolism or the simple truth that the place where you were most yourself before things got complicated is where you instinctively go when the complications become untenable. The Graces attended her on Cyprus. She was bathed and anointed and dressed and restored to herself in the most literal ritual sense that ancient religious practice could provide. The sources do not dwell on what she was feeling during this process. Ancient authors were generally not in the business of narrating the internal experience of divine recovery, but the detail that she was received and cared for by the Graces, who embody a quality of generous, undemanding attention that is exactly what the gods of Olympus had notably failed to provide during the public spectacle, says something. The real scandal, and this is the paradox that the ancient world understood with an ambivalence that continues to reward examination, was that the gathered gods, who had come to witness justice being delivered, ended up as participants in something rather different. They came to see Hephaestus's grievance acknowledged and validated. They ended up watching Hermes publicly admit he would gladly be in Ares' position, watching Poseidon negotiate terms with the composure of a magistrate, watching Apollo frame the whole situation as a philosophical question about desire and social convention. The tone was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of morally deficient, but wrong in the sense of misaligned with what the occasion was supposed to be. What Hephaestus had organised was, in theatrical terms, a trial. What he actually produced was a salon discussion about the nature of desire that happened to include two people who could not leave the room. The audience's failure to respond with the gravity and moral clarity that the situation demanded was not carelessness or cruelty, it was the gods being precisely and inevitably what they were, beings for whom Aphrodite's jurisdiction was permanently in operation, beings who could not fully condemn the mechanism of desire because they were all subject to it, beings who found in Hermes's honest answer a recognition they could not entirely disavow, even in a context that was supposed to be about something else entirely. And this is where the paradox that the ancient sources find most interesting becomes visible. Hephaestus, who had been wronged in a way that was both personal and socially visible, had executed his response with extraordinary technical competence, and had achieved, by any objective measure, the outcome he had set up. The affair was exposed, the parties were publicly humiliated, the grievance was acknowledged, and a legal mechanism for compensation was set in motion. By the logic of his world, he had won. He had addressed the situation with precision, and produced the intended result with efficiency that no divine confrontation fought through direct force could have matched. And yet the assembled gods walked away, not with the feeling that justice had been served, but with the faintly uncomfortable feeling that they had all just participated in something that reflected poorly on everyone in the room, including, and perhaps especially, the person who had organised the event. The trap that was supposed to expose Aphrodite and Ares had exposed something else instead. The machinery of a marriage that had never been right. The frustration of a craftsman who could build anything except the relationship he wanted, and the particular awkwardness of addressing a fundamentally human emotional problem through engineering. The gods saw all of this, and they laughed. But the laughter had something slightly strained in it. The laughter of people who have witnessed something more than they signed up to witness, and are using humour to manage the excess. There is a version of this story, less commonly cited but worth knowing, in which the Olympian response to the trap goes even further in the direction of the paradoxical, with some accounts suggesting that afterward it was Hephaestus rather than Ares or Aphrodite who found his position on Olympus somewhat awkward, not formally diminished, not punished, simply subject to the particular social discomfort that attaches to the person who has made a scene, regardless of how legitimate the grievance behind the scene was. He had been correct. He had been wronged. He had assembled compelling evidence and presented it in public with impeccable technical execution, and the atmosphere on Olympus afterward contained a faint quality of the morning after an argument, where one party was entirely right, and made their rightness so thoroughly and publicly apparent that it stopped being about the argument and started being about the manner of its resolution. The ancient Greek term for this is not overreaction, exactly. The Greeks had a fairly robust tolerance for dramatic responses to genuine wrongs. It is closer to the concept of hubris in its more nuanced sense. Not pride in the simple meaning, but a specific overstepping of the appropriate measure of response, a use of means that exceeded what the situation called for in ways that reflected something about the person using them. Hephaestus's trap was extraordinary. It was also, in some sense, a demonstration of the wrong thing, of his capacity to build perfect mechanisms for catching people who had wronged him, rather than his capacity to engage with the situation in the register that might actually have addressed what was wrong. He answered an emotional problem with an engineering solution, and the engineering solution worked perfectly, and it did not solve the emotional problem. This is a pattern that the gods of Olympus, who had more time than anyone to observe it, apparently found both comprehensible and slightly exhausting. What the story of the golden net ultimately reveals about Hephaestus is something that the story of the marriage gestured at but could not fully demonstrate until the crisis arrived. That his most profound capabilities and his most significant limitations were the same thing, viewed from different angles. His ability to think systematically, to plan over long-time horizons, to build mechanisms that would function with precision in complex situations, to engineer outcomes that raw strength could not produce. These were extraordinary qualities, and in most of the situations that required them on Olympus, they were exactly what was needed. In this situation, they produced a result that was correct and complete and somehow insufficient, because the situation was not the kind of situation that engineering could resolve. It was the kind of situation that required something he had never quite learned. which was how to be present in a moment of genuine pain without immediately converting that pain into a project. The gods dispersed. The net went back to wherever Hephaestus stored his inventions, somewhere in the forge presumably, in whatever organizational system he used for objects that had served their purpose and might conceivably serve another one later. The marriage continued to exist in formal terms for some time afterward, because formal dissolution required its own set of negotiations and social acknowledgements, and because the form of institutions tends to outlast the substance they were meant to contain, which is true on Olympus as it is everywhere else. The household on Olympus was maintained. The forge continued operating, and somewhere, significantly, the relationship between Aphrodite and Ares, who had been caught together, separated and sent to their respective geographical corners, continued because the trap had caught them and released them, but had not changed what they were to each other or what drew them together in the first place. This is not mentioned prominently in most tellings of the trap story, but it is present in the mythological tradition. The affair did not end with the exposure. This is, on reflection, not surprising. The net could catch them. It could not undo the reason they had been there, and the reason they had been there is a subject worth its own examination. A story not about failure or transgression, but about two divine beings who were, between them, one of the most consequential pairings in the Greek mythological imagination: love and war, desire and conflict, the goddess who drew things together, and the god whose nature was to put them in violent opposition. What they produced together, and what the mythology records as their children, turns out to say something far more interesting about the nature of both than the trap story can contain. That is the story of their children, and it begins with a wedding that everyone in the mythological world was invited to, that produced gifts of extraordinary beauty and an inheritance of extraordinary complexity. And that makes more sense when you understand that the parents who gave the child her name had between them covered most of the essential territory of human experience long before she was born. Harmony was their daughter, which is either the most optimistic thing the Greek mythological imagination ever produced, or a very dry observation about the fact that the only thing capable of emerging from the meeting of love and war, when both are operating at full intensity, is either total destruction or an arrangement in which the opposite forces somehow hold each other in place. The mythology chose to call this arrangement harmony and give her a wedding, which was both a beautiful idea and, as the subsequent mythology of that wedding makes entirely clear, a situation that the universe had a complicated relationship with sustaining. Harmony was born from an affair that ended in a golden net, which is either the mythology's most ironic casting choice or a very precise observation about where genuine reconciliation actually comes from, not from smooth beginnings and compatible temperaments and administratively correct arrangements, but from the full collision of opposite forces that have nowhere left to run from each other: love and war. The two most destabilizing powers in the Greek theological system, briefly contained in the same room by a trap made of invisible metal, subsequently released to continue being what they were, and what they produced between them, in due course, was a daughter named Harmony. This is funnier and more profound than it sounds, and the ancient world clearly thought so too, because the wedding of Harmony became one of the most elaborately described events in Greek mythological literature, a celebration so grand, so attended by every significant divine and heroic figure of the age, so laden with extraordinary gifts, that it set a standard for weddings that subsequent mythology would spend centuries failing to meet. All the gods came, the muses sang, the gifts were extraordinary, and the marriage that followed, between Harmony and the Theban hero Cadmus, proceeded to generate a family history that was, by any objective measure, one of the most comprehensively tragic in the entire Greek mythological canon. The descendants of the daughter of love and war included Semele, who was incinerated by the unfiltered presence of Zeus, Agave, who killed her own son Pentheus in a state of divine madness, and a sequence of further catastrophes that makes the entire Theban royal line look like the universe's most dedicated case study in what happens when divine heritage and human circumstance interact without adequate supervision. This outcome, Harmony as the origin point of sustained dynastic disaster, is either terrible irony or sophisticated mythological commentary on what harmony actually is and what it costs. The name does not promise ease. It promises something more like the resolution of tension that holds a structure together, the specific arrangement of opposing forces that produces stability, not by eliminating the opposition, but by holding it in a productive balance that requires constant maintenance. A harmony in music is not silence. It is not the absence of different notes. It is multiple different notes occurring simultaneously in a relationship that makes the difference between them into something beautiful rather than chaotic. By this definition, Harmony, the daughter of Aphrodite and Ares, makes complete sense. She is what you get when the forces of love and war are in relationship rather than simply in conflict, and the result is not peace in any comfortable sense, but a particular kind of dynamic order that is always one miscalculation away from becoming its opposite. The wedding gift that Hephaestus sent, because yes, Hephaestus, who was Aphrodite's formal husband, and the god from whose bed and workshop the entire situation had been conducted, deserves a moment's attention for the sheer audacity of the gesture. He sent a necklace. Specifically, he sent the necklace of Harmonia, which was a piece of jewellery of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary craftsmanship, as you would expect from the most skilled maker in the divine pantheon. It was also cursed. Whether this was intentional or the inevitable consequence of being made in a particular emotional register by a particular craftsman at a particular moment in his personal life, is a question the mythology leaves carefully open. What the mythology is clear about is the outcome. The necklace brought misfortune to every person who wore it, with a consistency and duration that suggests either a very effective curse or extremely bad luck distributed across an impressive number of individuals over several generations. It was passed through the Theban royal line, then later acquired by figures in the saga of the Seven Against Thebes, and at every stop it functioned as a kind of beautiful mobile catastrophe. Hephaestus gave a wedding gift to the daughter of his wife's affair that ruined everyone who received it across multiple generations. Whether this was revenge, grief, or simply the natural output of a forge operating under complicated emotional conditions is, again, a question the mythology prefers not to answer directly. The necklace was beautiful. The necklace was terrible. Both things were true simultaneously, which is entirely consistent with everything we have established about how Hephaestus expressed his interior life through the medium of metalwork. Now, before getting too far into the children of Aphrodite and what they reveal about her nature, it is necessary to address a figure who tends to appear in popular depictions as a small winged child with a bow and who bears only a superficial resemblance to the actual Eros of the ancient Greek theological tradition. The chubby baby archer, known in later Latin tradition as Cupid, and most familiar today from Valentine's Day imagery, is a significantly reduced version of a figure who was, in the original mythology, considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. The ancient Eros, as a cosmological entity, has already been discussed. The primordial force of attraction that existed before the gods, one of the first things to emerge from chaos at the foundation of the universe. What matters for this chapter is the relationship between that cosmic figure and the specific divine being who functions as Aphrodite's son, companion, and most famous instrument. The genealogy of Eros in the ancient sources is, not unusually, somewhat disputed. In some traditions, he is one of the original primordial forces, predating the gods and existing independently of any parentage. In others, he is the son of Aphrodite, usually by Ares, a divine child rather than a cosmic principle. In still others, he is both simultaneously a figure who bridges the primordial and the Olympian, who carries the ancient force of attraction inside a divine person who has history and character, and the specific qualities that come from being someone's child. The tension between these versions mirrors, with remarkable precision, the tension between Aphrodite's own two birth stories, the ancient, ungovernable force versus the family-embedded divine person, and this is probably not coincidental. Mother and son share the quality of being both older than the system they operate within, and fully part of it, both cosmic in their reach and personal in their operation. The figure most familiar from literary sources, Eros as Aphrodite's son, the winged deity with the bow who shoots arrows into people without warning or apology, is interesting precisely because he literalizes something true about desire. The arrows are a metaphor, but they are a metaphor for a real phenomenological experience. The way desire arrives suddenly, from an unexpected direction, before the rational mind has had any opportunity to prepare a response. You do not see the arrow coming, you do not decide to be struck. One moment you are going about your business, and the next moment you are reorganized around something you did not have in your life 5 minutes ago. The bow model captures this with an accuracy that more sophisticated philosophical frameworks sometimes obscure. Whatever desire is at the experiential level, it does not feel like a decision. It feels like being hit. And Eros, however he has been depicted in any particular century, preserves this essential quality. He acts, and others are acted upon, and the gap between the two is absolute. What the later tradition's baby with bow imagery loses is the element of genuine power. The sense that Eros is not a decorative symbol of romance, but an active force operating in the world with its own agenda, its own logic, and no particular interest in whether the people it affects find the situation convenient. The early artistic tradition, before the Hellenistic period started depicting him as increasingly small and cherubic, the ancient equivalent of making something less threatening by making it cute, showed Eros as a young man, athletic and capable, with the specific combination of beauty and indifference that attends something genuinely dangerous. He was not a symbol. He was an agent. He did not decorate scenes of love. He caused them, often without warning, and with consequences that extended well beyond the immediate moment of attraction. Anteros is Eros's counterpart and, in some traditions, his twin, and he is one of the most underappreciated figures in the entire Greek mythological system, which is unfortunate because what he represents is one of the more precise observations that ancient theology made about how love actually works. His name means, approximately, counter-love or love returned, and he was understood as the deity governing mutual desire, the specific quality of love that exists when it flows in both directions, when the person who desires is also desired, when the longing is not solitary but shared. He was also, in some traditions, the deity who punished those who refused to return love, who allowed themselves to be loved without reciprocating, who accepted desire from another person and gave nothing back. This framing tells you something interesting about what the ancient world considered the moral stakes of desire. You could be held accountable not for causing love, but for refusing to honor it when it arrived, for treating another person's genuine emotional reality as something you could benefit from without any obligation of response. This is a more sophisticated ethical position than the mythology's popular reputation tends to credit. Love, in the Anteros tradition, is not simply something that happens to you and that you're therefore not responsible for managing. It creates obligations. When someone loves you, you are not required to love them back. Desire cannot be compelled, and Aphrodite would be the first to observe that forced love is not love at all. But you are required to take the reality of what they feel seriously, to respond to it honestly, to not simply absorb it as a resource while offering nothing in return. Anteros is the deity who represents the other side of desire, not its initial arrival, but its reciprocation, not the arrow but the moment when the person who is struck has to decide what to do with that experience in the context of another human being who is waiting for a response. Pothos is a figure whose name translates most precisely as longing, specifically the kind of longing directed at something or someone absent. Where Eros represents the force of desire in the present tense, in proximity to its object, Pothos represents the experience of desire without the presence of what is desired, the specific ache of wanting something you cannot currently have or reach or touch, the particular emotional quality of an absence that has a shape. This distinction is more important than it might initially appear. The ancient Greeks were precise enough about emotional taxonomy to give individual divine figures to states that modern culture tends to lump together under the general heading of love. They noticed that wanting someone who is present feels different from wanting someone who is not there, and they gave each state its own deity, which is either profound attention to emotional detail or evidence that the Greek pantheon had a notably comprehensive organizational structure. Probably both. Hymeros, another of Aphrodite's attendants, and in some traditions another of her divine offspring, represents desire in its most immediate and urgent form, the specific quality of wanting that operates in real time, the heat of attraction in the present moment with none of the reflective or longing quality that characterizes Pothos. Together, Eros, Anteros, Pothos, and Himeros form something that functions less like a list of related deities and more like a phenomenological map of desire in all its distinct registers: the arrow that strikes unexpectedly, the obligation of return, the ache of absence, the heat of immediate presence. This map is extraordinarily precise. It makes the point that love is not a single thing with minor variations, but a family of related but distinct experiences, each with its own character, its own ethics, and its own divine patron who could be appealed to specifically rather than addressed under a general umbrella. The practical implications of this taxonomy for ancient religious life were significant. Someone dealing with unrequited love was in Anteros's domain as much as Eros's. Someone suffering from the absence of a person they loved might make offerings to Pothos. The refinement allowed people to identify their specific emotional situation with some precision and address their prayers accordingly, which has a certain theological elegance. A religious system that can distinguish between different kinds of love and give each one a specific divine face is a system that is taking its worshippers' actual experience seriously. Harmonia, then, was not an anomaly among Aphrodite's children. She was, like the others, a divine embodiment of a specific thing. In her case, the quality of resolution that emerges when opposing forces are held in productive tension, rather than allowed to simply destroy each other. That she was born from the most famously incompatible union in Olympian mythology is not the irony it first appears to be. It is the point. The mythology is saying, with characteristic indirection, that harmony is not found where there is no opposition. It is found, when it is found at all, precisely in the space between love and war, between the force that draws things together and the force that drives them apart, between the desire for closeness and the reality of difference. The necklace that Hephaestus made for her wedding was probably not accidental. The man who had spent his entire marriage trying to bridge an incompatibility that could not be bridged through any amount of craftsmanship made his wedding gift to the daughter of that incompatibility a beautiful object that transmitted misfortune down through generations. He made, in other words, a perfect physical metaphor for what the marriage of love and war actually produces, something extraordinary and something that carries, inside its beauty, a property you cannot remove without destroying the thing itself. The most emotionally vivid story in Aphrodite's mythological catalogue, and there is significant competition for this title, does not involve any of her divine children. It involves a mortal, or rather, a figure who begins as mortal and ends as something else entirely, whose story is structured by three forces simultaneously: desire, death, and the turning of the year. His name was Adonis, and the ancient world's feeling about him was sufficiently intense that his cult lasted, in various forms, for well over 1,000 years across multiple civilizations, which is the kind of longevity that suggests the story was doing something more than simply being entertaining. The origin of Adonis is already strange before the main story begins, and the strangeness is intentional. He was born from a tree, specifically from the myrrh tree into which his mother Myrrha had been transformed after a situation of considerable moral complexity that ancient sources handle with varying degrees of directness. The short version is that Myrrha was afflicted with an impossible desire by Aphrodite herself, as punishment for her mother's boast that Myrrha was more beautiful than the goddess, which, as provocations go, was not subtle, and which represents exactly the kind of situation that the chapter on Aphrodite's power established as the most targeted form of divine retribution available in the Greek theological system. The consequences were terrible for everyone involved. The transformation into myrrh was in some traditions merciful, in others simply the neutral operation of divine justice which had its own agenda and was not overly concerned with the feelings of the people being processed through it. After some months, the myrrh tree split open and Adonis was born, already impossibly beautiful, already fated, already carrying inside him the specific quality that was going to make his short life one of the most mythologically consequential in the entire tradition. The myrrh tree origin is worth pausing on because it embeds in the story's very beginning the themes that will define its ending. Myrrh is a resin, a substance produced by a tree in response to wounding. You get myrrh by cutting the bark and collecting what flows from the wound. It was one of the most prized substances in the ancient Mediterranean world, used in perfumes, in incense, in the preparation of bodies for burial, in religious rituals across multiple traditions. It smells simultaneously of sweetness and something sharper, something that has come from below the surface, from the inner life of the tree rather than its flowers or fruit. The fact that Adonis is born from this specific substance is not decorative. He is born from a wound, from transformation through suffering, from the raw material that ancient ritual used to honor both life and death. He carries all of this before he has done anything, simply by virtue of where he came from. Aphrodite found him. The sources vary on exactly how she came to know of him, In some versions she saw him when he was still an infant, in others when he was already a young man of devastating beauty. But what is consistent is the immediate and overwhelming nature of what she felt. This is presented in the mythology not as irony, the goddess of love falling in love, but as evidence of how the force she embodied operated without regard for who it was acting on. She was not exempt from the power she represented. She had in fact never claimed to be. The gods who were exempt from desire, Athena, Artemis, Hestia, were exempt because their divine constitution simply did not include the relevant mechanism. Aphrodite's divine constitution was the mechanism. She was, in a sense, the most vulnerable being in the entire Greek pantheon to the force she personified, because there was no distance between herself and what she was. When she desired Adonis, she was experiencing from the inside what she caused in others, which either proves that she had full personal understanding of what she was doing when she deployed her power on unwilling recipients, or proves that the force was simply what it was, and operated the same way regardless of who was in its path. Ancient authors found this theologically interesting enough to have Aphrodite behave in ways that were recognizably human in their quality. The anxiety, the possessiveness, the desperate attempt to keep him away from danger, precisely because the feeling she was experiencing was the same feeling that she had been causing in mortals for the entire history of the mythology. She did things she did not normally do. She went hunting with him, which was explicitly outside her usual domain, and which required wearing clothes unsuitable for a goddess who spent most of her time in gardens. She stayed in the woods and fields, following him through terrain that was not hers in any mythological sense. The hunting ground belonged to Artemis, and Aphrodite in the forest is a figure operating significantly outside her comfort zone, which is the ancient equivalent of someone who works in digital media voluntarily spending time at a mining expo, because the person they care about is there. She tried to warn him about the boar. The boar was a known danger. Ancient boar hunting was not a casual activity, and boars were respected even by experienced hunters for their combination of speed, power, and complete indifference to human feelings about the situation. She told him to be careful. She told him that the things worth hunting were the ones that ran from you, not the ones that might turn around. He did not listen. He was young, and he was skilled, and he was the kind of person who has been told they are extraordinary, so consistently that they have made peace with most things being manageable for them, which is a perfectly reasonable conclusion to reach, if you have been raised on evidence, and a perfectly terrible one, if the specific risk you are facing happens to be genuinely outside the category of the manageable. The boar was outside the category of the manageable. The encounter was brief and absolute. Adonis was wounded, and the wound was fatal, and Aphrodite found him dying in the field and held him as he died, and the anemone flowers that bloomed from his blood where it touched the ground were the mythology's way of saying that beauty persists, even through the absolute termination of the beautiful thing, that desire leaves a mark in the world that outlasts the object of desire, that grief, when it is deep enough, changes the landscape permanently rather than simply passing through it. This is where the story became a myth in the fullest sense, where the individual narrative of a beautiful young man and the goddess who loved him became a story about something much larger than either of them. Because Adonis did not simply die, he became a principle. He became the way the ancient world explained the agricultural year, the cycle of growth and death and return that structured every civilization in the Mediterranean world, on which all human life depended, and which required a story large enough to carry the weight of what it meant. The story worked like this. When Adonis died, the world went cold. Aphrodite's grief was not a private emotional event, but a cosmic one, because the goddess of love in mourning was the world in a state of withdrawal, the force of desire and growth, and the generative principle that made living things flourish, temporarily suspended. The flowers did not grow the way they had. The animals did not pair the way they had. The fields did not produce as they had. The world in Aphrodite's grief was the world that had lost something central to its own functioning, and the feeling of that loss was what mortals called winter. Adonis, meanwhile, had gone to the underworld, to the realm of Persephone, who governed the below-ground existence of all dead things, including seeds waiting for spring to bring them back. And Persephone, encountering Adonis there, was affected in exactly the way that anyone encountering something that Aphrodite had loved tended to be affected, deeply, specifically, and with a clarity of feeling that made the question of returning him considerably more complicated than a simple administrative handover. The dispute between Aphrodite and Persephone over Adonis is structurally a story about the tension between the above-ground world and the below-ground world, between the living and the dead, between desire and its inevitable terminus. Both goddesses loved him, one as the person he had been while alive, one as the person he was in death, in the quiet of the underworld where none of the urgency of the living world reached. Zeus was called upon to arbitrate, which means the dispute was significant enough to require the highest available divine adjudication, and his solution was characteristic: a division of time. Adonis would spend part of each year with Aphrodite in the world above, and part with Persephone in the world below. The mathematical specifics varied by source. Some traditions gave each goddess equal time, others gave Aphrodite the larger portion, but what mattered was the structure of the arrangement rather than the arithmetic. Adonis became a being of two worlds, a live part of the year, dead part of the year, the specific divine figure whose movement between these states corresponded to the movement of the seasons through their own cycle of growth and dormancy and return. His time in the upper world was spring and summer, the period of growth, of the opening of the earth, of desire in its active phase. His time in the lower world was autumn and winter, the withdrawal of growing things back into the earth, the period of cold and apparent death, the season of absence. This explains why the cult of Adonis was structured the way it was. The Adonia festival, celebrated across the Greek and Phoenician world, and documented in detail by sources including a particularly vivid passage in Aristophanes, took place in high summer at the peak of the growing season, and involved a combination of celebration and mourning that struck ancient observers as simultaneously appropriate and slightly paradoxical. Women planted Adonis gardens, small containers of earth in which they sowed fast-growing plants, wheat, barley, fennel, flowers, that would sprout quickly in the summer heat and then die just as quickly, their entire brief life visible within the span of the festival. These short-lived plants were the embodiment of Adonis himself. Beautiful, quickly grown, quickly gone. Women mourned his death with a public grief that was not performance, but genuine emotional engagement with the mortality that he represented. Not the mortality of any specific person they knew, but the mortality of everything beautiful and growing in the world, the basic fact that the thing that makes you love something is the same thing that makes it able to die. This ritual mourning was performed by women specifically, and it was performed openly, which was notable in a cultural context that generally preferred grief to be a private matter managed within the domestic sphere rather than expressed publicly on rooftops, which is where, according to various ancient sources, the women carried their Adonis gardens and performed their laments, high up in the light and heat, as close to the sun as an ordinary person could get. This rooftop quality of the ritual has been analysed in various ways. It may have been practical. The rooftop ensured maximum sunlight for the gardens. It may have been symbolic, the highest accessible point, closest to the sky and farthest from the underground realm that had taken Adonis. It may have been social, a public expression of a grief that was in some sense collective, a shared acknowledgement of loss that transcended the purely personal. Probably it was all of these simultaneously, which is how ancient rituals tend to work. The practical and the symbolic and the social layers reinforce each other until the whole is considerably more resonant than any single interpretation can fully account for. The Adonis myth entered the ancient world from the east, from the Levantine and Mesopotamian traditions that had similar figures, most notably Tammuz, the beloved of Inanna/Ishtar, whose death and mourning by the goddess followed a nearly identical structure. This connection is documented well enough at this point to be considered established rather than speculative. The story of the dying and returning beloved, mourned by the goddess of love, producing the seasonal cycle through the alternation of her grief and joy, was a narrative template that travelled through the ancient Mediterranean with the other cultural exchange goods that moved along the trade routes. On Cyprus, where Aphrodite's cult and the Phoenician Astarte cult had been in long contact, the identification between Adonis and Tammuz was particularly close, and the Adonia festival on Cyprus had features that preserved Levantine ritual elements within what had become Greek mythological framing. This matters for understanding what Adonis was, theologically, beyond the specific narrative of his individual story. He was a figure at the intersection of love and death and the agricultural cycle, a bridge between the human experience of desire and loss and the natural world's experience of growth and dormancy that made him useful to very different cultures as a way of making sense of the same fundamental observations about how the world worked. Every farming civilization in the ancient Mediterranean had to grapple with the fact that the earth goes cold, that the things that were growing stop growing, that the world enters a period of apparent death from which it must return. The story of a beautiful being who is mourned by the goddess of love and who returns with the spring was a way of making that cycle emotionally coherent, of giving it a face and a story, of making the abstract pattern of the seasons into something that people could feel alongside rather than simply observe. Aphrodite's grief for Adonis is the part of her mythology that shows her most fully in the register of human vulnerability. She is not, in this story, the terrifying power who arranges other people's desires and punishes those who disrespect her. She is someone who loved something she could not hold, who tried to warn the thing she loved about the danger it was in, who was there when the warning proved insufficient and held the dying thing in her arms, and then was left with the anemones and the cold and the long absence. This is not a triumphant mythological narrative. It is a story about the thing that love always risks, the absolute and permanent loss of the person who made your world different than it was before they were in it. The ancient world wept for Adonis on rooftops in the summer heat and planted fast-growing gardens that were going to die quickly, and knew that they were weeping for something more than the mythology was explicitly saying. They were weeping for the fact that everything beautiful and alive is also mortal, and that this is not a problem to be solved but a condition to be lived with, and that the goddess who presides over desire, who makes the world bright and urgent and worth wanting, is the same goddess who sits with the dying thing in the field and watches the anemones bloom from the wound. She knows both sides. She has always known both sides. That is, in the end, what makes her the goddess she is, not just the power of attraction, but the full weight of what attraction costs when the thing you are drawn toward does not stay. The apple that started the Trojan War was thrown by a goddess who was not invited to the wedding, which is either a cautionary tale about guest lists or a very precise mythological observation about what happens when you try to organize a celebration in a world that contains the divine embodiment of discord and then fail to include her on the invitation. Eris, the goddess of strife and contention, whose presence at any gathering was generally considered the social equivalent of a lit torch near a pile of dry timber, had not been included at the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a match between a mortal hero and a sea nymph that had attracted most of the Olympian pantheon to the festivities. The exclusion was presumably intentional. It was also, in retrospect, not the most strategically sound decision anyone has ever made. Eris arrived anyway, uninvited and apparently entirely untroubled by this fact, and she brought with her a single golden apple inscribed with the words, quote, 19. She threw it among the assembled guests and departed. This is a remarkably efficient piece of divine mischief, minimum personal investment, maximum lasting consequences. The apple was almost certainly aimed at producing exactly what it produced, because Eris understood her audience, and her audience included 3 goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each of whom had compelling personal reasons to believe that the apple was obviously and self-evidently meant for her, and none of whom was going to simply step back and let one of the others take it without a position being stated. The argument that developed among the 3 goddesses was, by all accounts, spectacular even by Olympian standards, which is saying something in a community that had produced the Golden Net episode, and any number of other events that would have been considered melodramatic in most other contexts. Zeus, who was asked to adjudicate and who possessed, on this occasion at least, the wisdom to recognize that judging a beauty contest between his wife, his daughter, and the goddess of love was not a responsibility he wanted anywhere near his desk, declined to participate. He outsourced the judgment to Paris, a prince of Troy who was at that point living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, after being left there as a child following a prophecy that he would bring destruction to his city. The prophecy was accurate. The Trojans, who had made the decision to leave him there and then brought him back when he proved to be a gifted athlete, had essentially performed the mythological equivalent of removing a safety mechanism, confirming it worked, and then reinstalling it wrong. Paris was, by the mythology's account, handsome, capable, and possessed of the specific quality of someone who's been told contradictory things about his worth, and has resolved the contradiction in favour of confident self-regard. He was not stupid. He was also not, as subsequent events demonstrated, the person you would select as your final arbiter in a dispute with consequences this large if you were in any way invested in the outcome going well for humanity broadly. But Zeus had made his choice, The three goddesses had accepted the terms, and the process was underway. Each goddess came to Paris on Mount Ida and made her case, and each case tells you something specific and interesting about what that goddess understood as the highest possible good, and by extension, what the ancient Greek imagination believed about what human beings actually value when forced to make a fundamental choice. Hera's offer was power. She offered to make Paris the ruler of vast territories, the kind of authority that reshapes the political landscape of the world, that puts the resources of kingdoms at your disposal, that makes other powerful people either your allies or your subordinates. This was not a small offer. In the ancient world, where political power meant the difference between safety and vulnerability, between wealth and poverty, between being the person who makes decisions and the person those decisions are made about, Hera's gift would have been considered by most reasonable assessors of the situation as the objectively most valuable thing on the table. It was entirely in keeping with her nature as the goddess who presided over the structure of legitimate authority, over marriages, households, kingdoms, the formal institutions through which human social life organized itself. She was offering what she was. Athena's offer was wisdom and military excellence, specifically the kind of strategic genius and battlefield capability that wins wars consistently, that makes you the most formidable presence in any conflict, that turns military encounters in your favor with a reliability that cannot be attributed to luck. This was also an extraordinary gift. The ancient world ran on military power at least as much as it ran on political power, and the ability to win battles reliably was the practical foundation beneath most of the other good things that civilization had to offer. Athena was offering what she embodied, the combination of intelligence and effective action that her mythology consistently characterized as the highest expression of what a human being could achieve in the realm of practical engagement with the world. Aphrodite offered Paris the most beautiful woman in the world. Now, if you approach this purely as an economic transaction, weighing the long-term strategic value of each offer against the upfront costs of accepting it, Aphrodite's offer looks significantly less competitive than the other two. Power and wisdom and military genius are durable goods. They compound. They give you advantages that produce further advantages, that open opportunities that would otherwise be closed, that change your fundamental position in the world in ways that persist and grow. The most beautiful woman in the world is a specific person, located in a specific place, already married to someone else, whose acquisition will require an international incident, and whose presence in your city will result in a 10-year military siege and the complete destruction of everything you love. This is not, as investment theses go, a particularly compelling one. And yet Paris chose it, with the speed of someone who has heard enough to know what he wants, and this choice destroyed Troy and sent the mythology of Aphrodite's power into the most visible and consequential story in the entire Greek tradition. The question worth sitting with is not whether Paris made a terrible decision. He clearly did, in the most dramatically demonstrable way possible. But why he made it, and what the mythology is saying about human motivation by having him make it. Because this was not presented in the ancient tradition as a simple story about a foolish young man overwhelmed by desire making a short-sighted choice. It was presented as a philosophical statement about what actually drives human beings when they are confronted with a genuine choice between the things they most deeply want. And the statement is uncomfortable, because it suggests that the ancient Greeks believed, with enough seriousness to put it at the center of their most important literary tradition, that what human beings ultimately choose, when all the options are present, is desire. Not security, not wisdom, not the sustainable long-term advantages that reason would recommend. The immediate, specific, overwhelming want for a particular thing that has no strategic justification, and every emotional one. This reading of the Judgment of Paris has been debated by scholars for a very long time, and the debate is productive precisely because the myth refuses to fully endorse or condemn Paris's choice. On one level, the choice is obviously catastrophic. It produces the Trojan War, which kills Paris himself, destroys his family, burns his city, and generates enough grief and loss to keep Homer occupied for the entire length of the Iliad, which is not a short poem. On another level, the choice is presented as simply what Paris did, as the expression of a nature that the mythological tradition treats with something closer to tragic inevitability than moral condemnation. He chose what he chose because he was the kind of person who would choose that, and the kind of person who would choose that is also the kind of person whose story the mythology finds most worth telling, which is an uncomfortable observation about what the Greek imagination considered most essentially human. What Paris's choice reveals about Aphrodite's power is something that the mythology has been building toward since her birth story, that her domain is not simply more pleasant than the alternatives, it is more fundamental. It operates at a level of human motivation that is prior to the cost-benefit analysis that reason performs, prior to the strategic thinking that identifies long-term advantages, prior to the institutional loyalties and social considerations that govern most of the decisions that hold civilization together. When desire is on the table, specific and immediate and felt in the body rather than calculated in the mind, it does not compete on the same terms as the other values. It wins differently. It wins by making the other values temporarily seem like they are describing a different person's life. Not yours, not now, not in this moment of absolute present tense clarity about what you want. The apple, in this reading, was not a beauty contest. It was a demonstration of what happens when the three most significant forces in the Greek theological imagination, power, wisdom, and desire, are made to compete for the same prize. The result was not inevitable in any mechanical sense. Paris could have chosen differently. The point is that he didn't, and that his not choosing differently was recognizable enough as human behavior that the ancient world built their most important war narrative on it, without apparent concern that audiences would find the motivation implausible. They found it entirely plausible. They may have found it embarrassingly recognizable. Aphrodite did not need to offer the largest thing on the table. She offered the thing that made Paris stop thinking about the table. The consequences of the judgment rippled through the entire Trojan War in ways that made Aphrodite's presence felt even when she was not literally on the battlefield. She protected Paris from direct destruction at several points in defiance of the war's general momentum. She appeared in the Iliad in person, removing Paris from a duel with Menelaus at the moment when it was about to produce a result that would have ended the war, which would have been considerably better for everyone in Troy and considerably less dramatic for the purposes of the epic. Her intervention to preserve Paris was not neutral assistance. It was the logic of her own investment. She had made a promise, the promise had been accepted, and the consequences of that promise were hers to manage. Whether she had fully anticipated a 10-year war when she made the offer on Mount Ida is, unfortunately, not recorded. Helen herself, the woman at the centre of the conflict, the promised prize whose presence in Troy was the formal cause of the war, is a figure whose relationship to Aphrodite's power illuminates something important about how divine influence operated on mortal decision-making in the Greek understanding. Helen is not, in most ancient treatments, simply a passive object who was moved from one place to another. She's a person who made choices, or who had choices made through her, or who found that the choices available to her were organized in advance by a divine power that had her under its influence before she was aware of the situation. The ambiguity about Helen's agency, which ancient authors handled with remarkable variation, from Homer's relatively dignified portrait of a woman conscious of her position to later traditions that distributed blame more actively, reflects the genuine theological complexity of what it meant to be subject to Aphrodite's influence. If a goddess could affect your very capacity for desire, then the question of your responsibility for subsequent actions was not simple. It was genuinely philosophically complicated. The ancient world did not resolve this complication tidily. Neither have we. The Trojan War, as the consequence of Aphrodite's contest victory, is the mythology's most explicit statement about the relationship between love and catastrophe, about the specific way in which desire, when it operates at civilizational scale and without the friction of ordinary social constraint, produces not intimacy, but destruction. The war lasted 10 years and consumed an entire generation of heroes on both sides. An entire city was removed from the world, its future cancelled in service to a conflict that had its proximate origin in a wedding apple and its immediate cause in a young man's choice between 3 divine offers on a mountain in Asia Minor. This is either a very efficient narrative machine for producing dramatic content or a serious mythological argument about what desire costs when it is not the desire of one person, but the organizing force of a civilization that has decided, collectively and in the person of its prince, that what matters most is the particular thing that Aphrodite alone could provide. Paris chose beauty. Troy paid for it. The scale of the payment was the mythology's way of demonstrating that Aphrodite's power was not personal in any limited sense. It was civilizational, The myth of Psyche and Eros occupies a completely different register than everything else in Aphrodite's mythology. Quieter in its setting, more intimate in its focus, more explicitly philosophical in its structure, and it arrives in the tradition relatively late compared to the stories that precede it. The fullest surviving version comes from Apuleius, a Roman author of the 2nd century CE, embedded within his novel, The Golden Ass, as a story told by an old woman to comfort a distressed young woman, which gives it from the beginning a quality of deliberate story within story that signals it is doing more than simply narrating events. It is a story about what love stories are for and what they teach. This framing matters, because by the time Apuleius wrote it down, the myth of Psyche was already understood as a particular kind of myth, not the kind that explained natural phenomena or divine genealogies, but the kind that illuminated something true about the interior experience of being a person who loves and is required by that love to become something more than they were. Psyche's name means soul in Greek, which is not a subtle naming choice. It is a declaration of intent from the beginning. This is not a story about a specific individual in the way that myths about Adonis or Paris are about specific individuals. It is a story about what happens to the soul when it encounters love, what it goes through, what it loses, what it has to become in order to arrive at something permanent. The story is an initiation narrative dressed in a love story, and the dress fits so well that the two layers are genuinely inseparable. The setup begins with the problem that started everything. Psyche was a mortal girl of extraordinary beauty, beauty so exceptional that people began to worship her instead of Aphrodite, diverting the cult's offerings and attentions toward a human face rather than the divine one. This was, from Aphrodite's perspective, a professional problem of the most direct kind. She was the goddess of beauty. Having mortals redirect their religious attention toward a human woman on the grounds that the human woman was more beautiful than the goddess of beauty was an affront that required a response. The response she selected was to use Eros as her instrument. She sent him to cause Psyche to fall in love with the most wretched being that could be found, so that the girl whose beauty had been praised above Aphrodite's would spend her life in an appropriate humbling. This plan failed immediately and in the most ironic way possible, which is what tends to happen when you send the god of desire to cause desire and fail to adequately consider the occupational hazards involved. Eros saw Psyche, scratched himself on his own arrow. The sources vary between accidental and deliberate, and the ambiguity is probably intentional, because the difference between an accidental and a deliberate act of falling in love is genuinely philosophically interesting, and fell for her completely. Instead of making her fall for a terrible person, he arranged for her to come to him secretly, in a palace that appeared to her at the end of a cliff where an oracle had told her family she was destined to be married to something monstrous. The palace was real. The husband who came to her in the darkness was not monstrous in any of the ways that mattered. He simply would not let her see him in the light. This arrangement, contentment in darkness, prohibition against seeing, was the central structural tension of the myth, and it is the tension through which the story makes its philosophical point. Psyche was, by objective measures of quality of life, doing extremely well in the dark. The palace was magnificent. The company, when it came, was tender and attentive in ways that made the rest of her life seem like a rough draft by comparison. The prohibition against light was the only requirement, and the requirement was clearly important to her husband in ways she was not yet in a position to fully understand. By the logic of contentment, the darkness was not a problem. By the logic of knowledge, it was the entire problem. Her sisters introduced the specific fear that Psyche had not quite managed to generate entirely on her own. What if the being in the darkness was in fact monstrous? What if the prohibition against light was not a condition of love but a concealment of something terrible? These questions were not answerable without light. Psyche knew this. She also knew that bringing light into the room was exactly what she'd been asked not to do, which meant that answering the questions required breaking the one rule that the entire arrangement rested on. She brought a lamp, and in the lamplight she saw not a monster but the most beautiful being she had ever encountered, which resolved the fear and created an entirely new problem in a single instant, because the lamp dripped oil on his shoulder as she leaned over him. The oil woke him, and what she saw in his face was not anger but something closer to a grief so complete and quiet that it was worse than anger would have been. He looked at her for a moment. Then he was gone. The departure of Eros after the lamp is the mythology's most precisely constructed moment of quiet devastation. He did not leave because she had disobeyed him, though she had. He left because trust, in the specific form that their relationship required, had been broken. Not maliciously, not even carelessly, but definitively. What Psyche had done was not choose knowledge over love in any simple sense. She had chosen the certainty of her own perception, what she could see with her own eyes, over the different kind of certainty that trust requires, the willingness to remain in uncertainty about specific things because the overall context of the relationship has given you sufficient reason to stay. She had been given every reason to stay. She had also been given, by her sisters and by her own accumulated doubt, enough uncertainty about the specific thing she could not see to make the lamp feel necessary. This is a dilemma that is genuinely not resolvable by assigning clear blame to either party, and the myth does not try. What the myth does instead is proceed. Psyche, having lost everything she had by choosing the lamp, engaged in the project of getting it back, which meant eventually engaging with Aphrodite directly. The divine authority whose original plan had been disrupted by Eros's deviation from instructions was not, at this point in the narrative, in a particularly generous frame of mind, and the 4 tasks she assigned to Psyche were structured to be, by any rational assessment, impossible for a mortal woman relying only on her own resources. The first task was sorting, an enormous quantity of mixed grain, wheat, millet, poppy seeds, lentils, and several others, dumped together into a single pile, to be sorted into separate heaps by nightfall. This was the kind of task that a person could understand intellectually and fail at completely, because the problem was not complex. It was simply too large. There were too many seeds and too little time and only 2 human hands to do the work. The ants arrived without being summoned, organized themselves with the efficiency that makes ants either admirable or slightly unnerving, depending on how you feel about collective entities, and completed the sorting before morning. The help was small, uninvited, and exactly sufficient, which is one of the story's ways of saying something about how the world responds to genuine need, not with spectacular divine intervention, but with the specific, targeted, just enough assistance that the moment requires. The second task required gathering wool from a flock of golden rams, divine animals whose aggression was not metaphorical, and whose fleece was the kind of treasure that attracted the specific divine attention that made the animals dangerous to approach directly. The green reeds growing at the water's edge spoke to her, and told her to wait until the heat of midday had passed, and the rams had gone to rest in the shade, and then to gather the fleece they had left on the thorns and brambles rather than approaching the animals themselves. The solution was not to confront the danger, but to work around it at the right time, to recognize that there was a path to what she needed that did not require a direct encounter with what could destroy her. The third task was collecting water from the Styx itself, the river that divided the living world from the dead, whose water was so potent that even God swore unbreakable oaths on it, and whose current was such that no ordinary vessel could approach it without being destroyed. An eagle, who served Zeus and who had his own reasons for being favourably disposed toward the resolution of this particular situation, took her flask and filled it from the river and returned it to her. Divine infrastructure, briefly redirected to human purposes by something larger than the task itself. The fourth and final task was the most dangerous, going to the underworld, to Persephone, to ask for a portion of divine beauty in a container and returning with it. Going to the underworld while alive was among the most extreme things the mythology recognized as achievable, and most of the figures who managed it were heroes of the First Order, with divine assistance and specific divine permission. Psyche managed it not through heroic force, but through following very precise instructions that were given to her along the way. Instructions about how to navigate the specific geography of the dead world, about what to accept and what to refuse, about the coins for the ferryman and the honey cakes for the guardian and every other small precise requirement of the journey. She went and she returned. The pattern across all 4 tasks is consistent and cumulative. Each one required something different from Psyche: patience, timing, the willingness to receive help, the courage to go to places that were genuinely dangerous, and none of them required what they initially appeared to require, which was the brute capability to do impossible things alone. They required a different kind of capability, the capacity to recognize what she needed, to be open to unexpected assistance, to work within the constraints of each situation rather than against them, to keep going when the going was genuinely terrible. The box from Persephone produced the story's second major moment of disobedience, and its more philosophically complex one. Unlike the lamp which Psyche brought out of fear and accumulated doubt, the box she opened out of something closer to hope and recognizable human vanity. She was carrying beauty in a container toward the person she loved, and she thought, if I am to be reunited with him, perhaps I should not arrive looking exactly as I currently look after everything I have been through. The logic was comprehensible in the most human way. It was also wrong. What was in the box caused her to fall into a sleep so deep it was indistinguishable from death, which is, on reflection, a meaningful endpoint for a journey through the underworld, and perhaps the story's way of saying that you cannot bring the dead world's gift back into the living one without it affecting you. Eros found her. He put the sleep back in the box and woke her, and then went to Zeus and made his case. And Zeus, who recognized love when he saw it operating at full capacity, and who had no particular interest in obstructing a situation that had Olympus's collective emotional attention, granted Psyche immortality and gave the union his formal sanction. Aphrodite, whose original plan had produced something entirely different from what she had intended, was formally reconciled to the outcome. The child that Psyche and Eros eventually produced was named Hedone, pleasure or joy, which was the mythology's final statement on the story, that love which has been tested through everything that could undo it and has survived produces eventually something that neither party could have had access to before the testing. Aphrodite's role in this transformation is the most theologically sophisticated aspect of the entire story. She appeared as the antagonist, the figure who assigned impossible tasks, who seemed to be working against the outcome Psyche was striving toward, who represented the divine authority that had to be satisfied before the union could be completed. And yet every task she assigned was exactly the task that Psyche needed to complete, in order to become someone who could actually hold what she was working toward. The figure who seemed to be preventing love was, through the precise structure of what she required, enabling love to become something permanent rather than something that would eventually be overwhelmed by the limitations of whoever was experiencing it. This is Aphrodite in her most complete theological function, not merely the force that causes desire, not the dangerous power that reorganizes lives without consent, not the goddess of beauty who arrived from the sea fully formed. She is, in this story, the entity who understands that love of the lasting kind requires the people experiencing it to be tested against everything that could undo it, and to survive those tests not by being unaffected, but by being changed in the specific direction that love requires. She's not kind in the conventional sense. She's something more useful than kind. She's accurate. She gives Psyche exactly what the situation demands, and the curriculum is indistinguishable from cruelty until you see what it produces. Zeus's granting of immortality at the story's end is not a reward for good behavior. It is a recognition of transformation. Psyche at the end of the story is not the same being as Psyche at the beginning. She has passed through the specific kind of change the Greeks associated with genuine initiation. The change that happens not gradually, but through a sequence of encounters with things large enough to be genuinely dangerous, that could genuinely end you if you engage with them carelessly. She is immortal because she has become the kind of being for whom mortality is no longer an accurate description. The love that produced this change was not comfortable. It was not safe. It cost her everything several times and required her to keep going after each loss. That is the story's definition of the love that lasts. Not the love that avoids difficulty, but the love that goes through difficulty without losing the thing that made it worth the journey in the first place. Aphrodite, who began the story as the obstacle between Psyche and what she wanted, ended it as the mother-in-law in the narrative's formal resolution. Psyche is welcomed into the divine family, the union is made permanent, and Hedone is born. The soul found what it was looking for. It just had to become something capable of holding it first. The ending of the Psyche story also quietly resolves a question that the Aphrodite mythology had been circling since the beginning. What is the relationship between beauty and the soul? Aphrodite's beauty, as described from her birth story onward, was not merely visual. It was a force, something that reorganized the perceptions of anyone who encountered it, that made everything else temporarily secondary, that operated with the autonomy of a natural phenomenon rather than as an attribute a person chose to display. Psyche's beauty, the mortal beauty that had provoked the whole situation by attracting worship intended for Aphrodite, was of a different kind. The beauty of a person who had not yet been anywhere, who had not yet been tested, who was beautiful in the way that an unplanted field is beautiful, with potential rather than with earned complexity. By the story's end, Psyche's beauty is of a different quality because she is of a different quality. The things she has done and survived and lost and kept going through have left their marks in ways that are not diminishments, but additions. Depth, where there was only surface, complexity where there was only simplicity, the specific kind of earned presence that comes from having been to the dark places and returned with what you went for. This is, in the mythology's implicit theology, a more complete beauty than the original. More complete because it is the beauty of a soul that has been through something rather than the beauty of a soul that has not yet been tried. Aphrodite, whose own beauty was forged in the collision of cosmic forces in the ancient ocean, recognized this. The goddess born from the sea and from everything that came before the organized world knew better than anyone what beauty that has been through fire looks like. It is the only kind she has ever really been. The Psyche myth was, among other things, the ancient world's most sophisticated argument for why love stories are not really about the arrival of love. They are about what love requires of the person who is trying to sustain it, what it asks you to become, what you have to be willing to lose, what you have to be willing to keep going toward even when the evidence for eventual success is minimal and the immediate evidence for stopping is everywhere. Aphrodite, across the whole arc of this mythology, has been the force that makes this demand. She does not make the demand pleasantly. She makes it with the complete indifference to discomfort that characterizes any genuine force of nature. But she makes it accurately, which is ultimately more useful than making it gently. And the story of the soul named Psyche is her most precise articulation of why. Before the Greeks gave her a name, before the sea foam and the shores of Cyprus and the hours with their garlands, before Hesiod sat down to work out the genealogy of the gods, and found himself confronted with a goddess who did not fit neatly into any available category. Before all of this, there was a woman standing on a mountain in Mesopotamia, dressed in the light of the evening star, and people were already giving her everything they had. She was not called Aphrodite then. She was called Inanna in Sumer, the oldest civilization whose written records we have, in the period roughly from 3500 BCE onward, which means that this specific divine figure, in some form recognizable as the ancestor of the goddess we have been discussing, was being worshipped for somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years before the Greeks came along and rebranded the enterprise. Put differently, by the time Homer was composing the Iliad and giving Aphrodite her most famous Olympian appearances, the tradition she represented was already older than the entire span of time that separates Homer from us. This is a piece of chronological perspective that tends to reset the scale of the conversation somewhat. Inanna was not a gentle deity. This is the first thing that distinguishes the earlier tradition from the popular modern understanding of what a goddess of love is supposed to be, and it is the distinction that requires the most adjustment for anyone approaching this material from the Valentine's Day direction. Inanna was simultaneously the goddess of love and the goddess of war, the deity of desire and the deity of combat, the power that drew people together and the power that drove them into violent opposition. She was associated with the planet Venus in both its morning and evening aspects, the morning star that rose before battle and the evening star that rose in the context of desire and festival. And the dual association was not considered contradictory. It was considered accurate. It reflected a theological understanding of what the most overwhelming human experiences had in common. The mythological tradition around Inanna is extraordinarily rich, and has survived in forms detailed enough to allow genuine theological analysis, which is remarkable for material that is between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. The most famous myth is the descent of Inanna into the underworld, a text that exists in multiple Sumerian versions and whose narrative structure bears a relationship to the Adonis myth discussed in the previous chapter that is too close to be accidental. In the descent, Inanna descends voluntarily to the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, and at each of the 7 gates of the underworld she is required to remove one of her divine garments and attributes, arriving at the center of the dead world stripped of everything that defined her status and power. She dies there. The world above, deprived of the goddess of love and fertility, ceases to function in the relevant departments. Desire goes out of the world, growth stops, the animals cease to reproduce. The gods above become concerned, which is the mythological understatement of several millennia. Eventually, through a complex series of negotiations and divine interventions, Inanna is restored to life and returns to the upper world. But the price of her return is that someone must take her place in the underworld, and the person who ends up paying this price is Dumuzi, her beloved, who is taken by the demons of the dead in her stead, and who spends half of each year below the earth while his sister spends the other half, which is the Sumerian explanation for the agricultural seasons that operates through the same structural logic as the Adonis myth. The transition from Inanna to Ishtar represents the absorption of the Sumerian tradition into the Akkadian and Babylonian world following the political changes of the late 3rd millennium BCE, and it is instructive in itself as an example of how divine traditions survive political change. The Akkadians who absorbed and transformed Sumerian culture did not discard Inanna. They renamed her, adjusted some of her attributes to fit their own theological framework, and incorporated her into the Akkadian pantheon as Ishtar, a figure who retained the essential dual character of her predecessor while also developing new dimensions appropriate to her new cultural context. Ishtar was, if anything, even more explicitly martial than Inanna. She was the patron of armies, the deity invoked before battles, the goddess who appeared in military iconography, holding weapons alongside the traditional symbols of love and fertility. She was depicted standing on a lion, the animal sacred to her, armed with a bow and arrows, crowned with the horned headdress of divinity. This was not a soft image. This was a figure whose capacity for destruction was as much a part of her divine profile as her capacity for desire. The question of why the love goddess and the war goddess were the same figure in the Mesopotamian tradition is one that has generated considerable scholarly discussion, and the answers that have been proposed are worth examining because they illuminate something important about the theological tradition that eventually produced Aphrodite. One answer is cosmological. In the Mesopotamian astrological system, Venus, the planet most closely associated with the goddess, rose as the morning star before major battles and set as the evening star at the beginning of the night, and this dual celestial role was mirrored in the deity's dual earthly function. Another answer is phenomenological, the observation, already noted in the context of Inanna, that desire and combat share structural features that made their embodiment in the same divine figure feel accurate rather than contradictory. A third answer is social. In a civilization organized around both warfare and reproduction, as the primary engines of collective survival, the deity who governed the most essential human drives would naturally govern both, because separating them would have been an artificial theological distinction that did not correspond to how the actual human beings in question experienced their lives. All three of these answers are probably simultaneously true, which is the normal situation with ancient religious questions. What they combine to suggest is that the tradition Aphrodite inherited was not simply a tradition about love in any limited sense. It was a tradition about the forces that make human beings most intensely alive, the forces that produce both the deepest connection and the most complete destruction, that operate at the extremes of experience where the ordinary self is temporarily dissolved and replaced by something larger and more urgent. This is a considerably broader theological mandate than popular depictions of Aphrodite tend to suggest, and it explains aspects of her mythology that are otherwise puzzling. Her ability to start wars, her association with weapons in some ancient iconographic traditions, her role in events that produce catastrophe rather than romance, her character in the Iliad as a force actively involved in the most destructive conflict in the Greek mythological tradition. Astarte was the Phoenician version of this same goddess, and she was the version that came to Cyprus and deposited her tradition directly on the soil where Aphrodite would eventually be said to have landed. The Phoenicians were among the most consequential traders in the ancient Mediterranean world, not in the aggressive territorial sense, but in the cultural sense, as the people whose ships and merchants connected the eastern Mediterranean coast to the western, who established trading colonies across the sea from Sidon to Carthage, and who carried their religion with them as a matter of cultural identity, rather than leaving it at home when they travelled. Wherever Phoenician traders and colonists settled, Astarte came with them, and wherever Astarte came, she brought her full theological profile: love, war, the evening star, the lion, the dove, the specific quality of a deity whose power was experienced as both beautiful and dangerous simultaneously. On Cyprus, where Phoenician settlement was substantial and long-lasting, dating back at least to the 9th century BCE and possibly earlier, Astarte's cult and the existing pre-Greek goddess worship of the island encountered each other in conditions that favoured synthesis rather than conflict. The conditions that favoured synthesis were, in brief, geographic isolation, cultural mixing, economic interdependence, and the absence of any single overwhelming political authority that was invested in maintaining strict theological boundaries. Cyprus was nobody's backyard in a way that would have required ideological uniformity. It was a meeting point, and meeting points, over sufficient time, tend to produce hybrids rather than preserving any of their source traditions in pure form. The sanctuary at Paphos, which was established as Aphrodite's primary cult site, sits directly on the accumulated layers of this synthesis. Its religious practice as it existed in the classical Greek period retained elements that scholars have traced to the pre-Greek Bronze Age tradition, to the Phoenician Astarte cult, and to the developing Greek Olympian framework simultaneously. The festival calendar included elements that seemed to reflect multiple cultural layers operating simultaneously, none of them fully eliminated by the arrival of the next tradition. The process by which these layers accumulated on Cyprus is visible, with some effort, in the archaeological record, in the sequence of cult objects, the architectural changes to the sanctuary, the shifting iconographic styles of divine representations, the distribution of votive offerings from multiple cultural origins. It is the archaeology of a religious tradition that was always, from its earliest recoverable form, a composite rather than a pure expression of any single culture's theology. This is not a deficiency. It is the source of the tradition's remarkable longevity and its capacity to remain meaningful across very different cultural contexts. A religion that has been absorbing and integrating new influences for 1,000 years before the Greeks arrived is a religion that has developed considerable expertise in translation, in finding the shared elements beneath different surface forms, in maintaining the essential while adapting the expression. When Herodotus, the Greek historian of the 5th century BCE, travelling through the Near East and documenting religious practices with the combination of genuine curiosity and cultural assumptions that characterize his work, visited the great temple of Aphrodite at Ascalon in what is now Israel, he recognized the goddess there as Aphrodite Urania. He was right to recognize her, though for reasons more complicated than simple identification. What he was seeing at Ascalon was a form of Astarte whose worship had been going on at that site for centuries, before Greek cultural influence reached the Levantine coast, and whose character corresponded closely enough to Aphrodite's that the identification felt obvious. The goddess at Ascalon and the goddess at Paphos were, from Herodotus's perspective, the same deity with different local names and slightly different ritual forms. From the perspective of the archaeological record, they were different expressions of a shared ancestor that both traditions had developed independently from their common Near Eastern roots. Both perspectives contain something true. The relationship between Aphrodite and Astarte is not one of simple origin and copy, but of parallel development from shared materials, the way two rivers might descend from the same mountain by different routes, and arrive in the same sea carrying water that is related but not identical. The specific qualities that Aphrodite inherited from the Eastern tradition, and that distinguish her from the version of the love goddess that a purely internal Greek development would have produced, are worth identifying explicitly. The first is her martial dimension, which surfaces in the Iliad and in various other ancient sources, but which modern popular understanding tends to minimize or ignore. Aphrodite in Homer is not simply a passive figure who motivates conflict from a safe distance. She is present at the battles, she intervenes in them, she protects her favourites with an active directness that reflects a deity, whose domain includes the heightened states of combat, as well as of love. Several ancient cities in the Greek world had traditions of Aphrodite as a war goddess, Aphrodite Areia, Aphrodite of war, who was depicted in armour, to whom soldiers made offerings before battle, whose help was sought not in matters of the heart but in matters of military survival. This tradition is strange from the perspective of the Olympian Aphrodite most people know, and entirely coherent from the perspective of Inanna and Ishtar, whose martial dimension was central rather than marginal. The second quality is her association with death and rebirth, which shows up in the Adonis myth but also in various ritual and cultic contexts that connect her, not just to the living world's fertility, but to the cycle of death and return that structures the agricultural year. The descent motif, the love goddess entering the underworld, the world above going cold in her absence, the return of the goddess coinciding with the return of spring, is a pattern that connects Inanna's descent directly to the Adonia festivals and to the broader theological meaning of the seasonal Aphrodite. This dimension of the goddess did not develop independently in Greece. It arrived from the east with the tradition, and its presence in the Greek cult reflects the depth of the Eastern influence even in a religious system that had absorbed and partially recontextualized its origins. The third quality is her universality, the characteristic of being a deity whose jurisdiction crossed ethnic and political boundaries in ways that most ancient deities did not. Inanna and Ishtar were worshipped across multiple civilizations and political entities throughout the ancient Near East, maintained continuous worship through multiple political upheavals and changes of dominant culture, and survived the transition from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian to Assyrian cultural supremacy without losing their essential identity. Astarte performed a similar function in the Phoenician world, maintaining cult continuity across the Phoenician diaspora regardless of local political conditions. Aphrodite on Cyprus inherited this quality of transcultural relevance and extended it into the Greek world, eventually becoming one of the most broadly worshipped deities in the Mediterranean, the one divine figure whose jurisdiction was recognized as legitimate by essentially everyone because essentially everyone was already living in her domain. The ancient world's most explicit philosophical treatment of the Eastern dimension of Aphrodite's tradition appears in a different form from what you might expect, which is to say it appears not in a theological treatise or a scholarly comparison of religious traditions, but in a poem, Sappho of Lesbos, whose fragments have already appeared in this discussion as evidence of the intimate register in which the goddess could be approached, was working in a tradition that showed significant awareness of the Near Eastern material, filtered through the cultural exchange that the Aegean islands facilitated between the Greek and Phoenician worlds. Her hymns to Aphrodite, of which the most complete surviving example treats the goddess as a personal correspondent who appears in response to direct appeal, reflect a conception of divine accessibility that is closer to the Inanna tradition, where the goddess was addressed in intensely personal terms and was understood as genuinely present in the worshipper's life, than to the more formal Olympian theology of the mainland Greek tradition. The channel through which Near Eastern religious traditions reached the Greek world was not, in most cases, a single dramatic moment of cultural contact, but rather the continuous low-level exchange that characterized Mediterranean trade and colonization over several centuries. The Phoenician alphabet, the writing system from which the Greek alphabet was directly adapted in the 9th or 8th century BCE, was one of the most consequential pieces of cultural technology ever transferred between civilizations, and the transmission of writing carried with it a great deal of the cultural content that writing had been used to preserve and transmit. When the Greeks adopted the Phoenician script, they were also adopting a framework of literary and religious culture that had been encoded in that script for centuries, even as they transformed the content to fit their own developing theological and literary traditions. This means that the influence of the Near Eastern tradition on Aphrodite's mythology was not only a matter of direct religious contact, pilgrims visiting Phoenician shrines, Phoenician merchants describing their goddess to Greek trading partners, but also a matter of literary and theological inheritance embedded in the very tools of cultural transmission that the Greeks adopted. The stories, the imagery, the specific quality of a goddess who combined love and war and death and return, all of this was part of the cultural inheritance that came with the writing system, carried in the literature and ritual practice of the Phoenician world and available to Greek poets and theologians as material to be adapted and transformed rather than invented from scratch. The transformation that Greek culture performed on this inherited material was real and consequential. The specifically Greek contribution to the tradition was the systematic integration of the love goddess into the Olympian family structure, the genealogical thinking that made her the daughter of Zeus in the Homeric tradition, that gave her a defined relationship to the other Olympians, that located her within the political and social world of the Greek divine family rather than leaving her as a solitary cosmic power. The Greeks also developed the philosophical dimension of the tradition with an explicitness that the earlier cultures had not. The Platonic distinction between two Aphrodites, the philosophical analysis of Eros as a cosmic principle, the careful theological thinking about what desire is and how it works, that transformed religious feeling into intellectual inquiry and produced a tradition of analysis that Western philosophy has been drawing on ever since. But the essential character of the goddess, the combination of beauty and danger, the dual domain of love and its darker energies, the cosmic scope of a power that operated across civilizations and centuries without requiring any particular culture's permission, this was not a Greek invention. It arrived, already ancient, from the East, carried by traders and colonists and the slow diffusion of cultural exchange across the sea that connected all of these worlds. The Greeks recognized it, absorbed it, gave it new names and new stories and new philosophical frameworks, and sent it westward again in the form that has dominated the Western imagination ever since. This is, when you think about it, exactly what you would expect from a goddess whose most fundamental characteristic was the ability to cross boundaries between peoples, between categories, between the sacred and the ordinary, between the living world and the dead one. A deity defined by her capacity to be where you did not expect her, and to be recognized as herself regardless of what name was on the temple door, would naturally have a history that looked like this. Appearing everywhere in the ancient world under different names, being recognized across cultural boundaries as the same essential power, leaving traces in traditions that had no contact with each other and yet converged on the same divine profile. She was not contained by any single culture's mythology. She was the template that multiple cultures independently discovered they needed, because the thing she represented, the force of desire and beauty, and the overwhelming urgency of wanting something that transcends all rational calculation, was a feature of human experience that did not vary by geography or language or the particular organization of the local pantheon. The Greeks called her Aphrodite, and built her the most beautiful temples in the Mediterranean world, and wrote about her in some of the most lasting poetry that human civilization has produced. They did not create her. They recognized her. And the recognition was possible because she had been there, under various names and in various forms, for longer than the Greek world had existed, waiting, with the patience of something genuinely old and genuinely permanent, for each new civilization to find its own way of saying the same essential thing. The ancient world, in its best theological moments, understood this. The identification of Aphrodite with Astarte, of Astarte with Ishtar, of Ishtar with Inanna, was not confusion or theological sloppiness. It was the recognition of continuity, the acknowledgement that the force these figures represented was one force, manifesting in different cultural forms across different historical periods, and that the forms were interesting and various and worth studying individually, but that the underlying reality was a single thing that had been present in human experience from the beginning, and showed no signs of concluding its residency anytime soon. The Romans called her Venus. But that is the final chapter, and it is in some ways the most surprising turn in the entire story. Not the ending of a tradition, but its most dramatic expansion, into the bloodline of emperors and the founding mythology of an empire. The goddess born from the ancient sea, absorbed from the Eastern world, shaped by 1,000 years of Cypriot synthesis and Greek philosophical refinement, was about to acquire a political role that none of her earlier incarnations had anticipated. She was about to become Roman. There is a dimension of this cross-cultural history that the purely theological account tends to underemphasize, which is the commercial one. The goddess of love travelled the ancient Mediterranean along trade routes because love, or more precisely, the rituals and objects and devotional practices associated with the goddess of love, was commercially significant in ways that are easy to overlook from a modern distance that tends to separate religious life from economic life more completely than the ancient world ever did. The sanctuary at Paphos was not merely a religious institution, it was an economic one, a destination for pilgrims from across the Mediterranean who brought offerings and purchased ritual goods and whose travel supported the infrastructure of the island. The great temples of Astarte in the Phoenician cities were not separate from the commercial activity of those cities. They were embedded in it, beneficiaries of it, participants in the same networks of exchange that moved copper and cedar and purple dye and glass across the ancient world. This commercial dimension helps explain the speed and completeness with which the tradition spread. Religious ideas travel slowly when they depend entirely on deliberate missionary activity or military conquest. They travel much faster when they are attached to things that people want, objects, practices, ritual technologies, that are carried by the same networks that carry trade goods. The dove that was sacred to Astarte was also a bird that Phoenician sailors kept on ships as a navigation aid to find land when they were uncertain of their position. The same bird that belonged to the goddess was also the practical instrument of Mediterranean navigation, and this overlap is not a coincidence. It reflects the way that the sacred and the practical were woven together in the ancient world in ways that made each reinforce the other. The votive offerings found at Aphrodite's sanctuaries across the Greek world reflect this commercial integration directly. Terracotta figurines of the goddess were mass-produced, which is an extremely modern-sounding thing to say about objects made around 600 BCE, and yet accurate. In workshops that operated at scale, producing devotional objects in sufficient quantity to supply the retail market that existed around major sanctuaries, pilgrims arriving at Paphos or at the sanctuary at Corinth or at the Athenian establishment on the slopes of the Acropolis could purchase a figurine, make an offering, perform the appropriate ritual, and depart with the assurance that the transaction had been completed correctly. This system was so well developed by the classical Greek period that it resembled, in its basic structure, the souvenir market that surrounds major religious sites today, with the significant difference that the objects were understood as genuine channels of divine communication rather than mementos, a distinction that the ancient sellers probably maintained with somewhat more consistency than their modern counterparts. The specific rituals associated with Aphrodite's cult also travelled with the trade networks in ways that left traces in unusual places. The sacred prostitution that ancient sources describe at certain Aphrodite sanctuaries, a practice whose actual extent and character has been heavily debated by scholars, with most current scholarship concluding that ancient accounts significantly overstated and misunderstood what was actually happening, was reported at locations that corresponded closely to major trading centres: Corinth, Paphos, several Phoenician coastal cities. Whether or not the practice was what the ancient sources said it was, its reported presence at trading hubs reflects the intersection of commercial and sacred activity that characterized the goddess's cult in its most economically active expressions. What this commercial dimension ultimately demonstrates about the tradition is something that the purely theological history tends to obscure. The tradition spread because it was useful. Not useful in a cynical or reductive sense, but useful in the way that genuinely important things are useful, because it addressed real needs, real experiences, real aspects of human life that required both practical frameworks and meaningful ritual expression. The goddess of love was worshipped because love was important, because desire was important, because the forces she represented were forces that everyone encountered and that required some means of engaging with, some set of practices and symbols and narratives through which the overwhelming quality of those experiences could be given form and meaning. She travelled along trade routes because trade routes connected people, and the connection of people was already her domain. The figure who emerged from this long process of travel and synthesis and cultural exchange was neither purely Greek, nor purely Near Eastern, nor purely Cypriot. She was all of these things, layered in a sequence that the archaeology preserves, but that any single account tends to flatten. She was Inanna in the Sumerian records, Ishtar in the Babylonian temples, Astarte in the Phoenician colonies, the unnamed goddess of the Bronze Age Cypriot sanctuaries, and finally Aphrodite in the Greek literary and philosophical tradition. Each name a different face of the same essential presence, each tradition a different idiom for saying the same essential thing about a force that had been operating in human experience since before any of these civilizations existed to name it. The philosophical tradition that the Greeks built around her, the analysis of Eros as a cosmic principle, the Platonic distinction between heavenly and earthly love, the Neo-Platonic elevation of desire into a metaphysical framework for understanding the soul's relationship to the divine, was the Greek civilization's particular contribution to this long conversation. It was genuinely important and genuinely original in its specific form. But it was not the beginning of the conversation. It was one voice in a discussion that had been going on for 3,000 years by the time Plato sat down to write the Symposium, in a tradition that included Sumerian hymns and Babylonian ritual texts and Phoenician temple inscriptions and Cypriot votive offerings, and the accumulated devotional practice of more individual worshippers than any count could encompass. The goddess born from the sea was in truth born from all of this, from the full breadth of the Mediterranean world's most persistent attempt to understand and give form to the force that made human beings most intensely aware of being alive. She was old when the Greeks found her. She's been getting older ever since, and she is, as the final chapter will demonstrate, not done yet. The Romans, when they encountered Aphrodite in the Greek world, did what the Romans did with most things they found impressive. They took it, adapted it to their own purposes, gave it a Latin name, and proceeded to act as if the resulting product had been theirs all along. This is not a criticism. The Romans were extraordinarily good at absorption and transformation, and what they did with Aphrodite was not a diminishment but an expansion, a process of adding dimensions to an already complex figure that produced something genuinely new while preserving what had come before. They called her Venus, and they made her into something that the Greek tradition had never quite attempted: the ancestral mother of a ruling dynasty and the theological foundation of an empire. The identification of Venus with Aphrodite was, in the early stages of Roman engagement with Greek culture, a relatively straightforward piece of theological alignment, the kind of cross-cultural divine equation that Rome performed routinely as it absorbed the religions of the peoples it encountered. The Romans had their own indigenous Venus, a goddess of gardens and the spring season, and the generative vitality of growing things, who predated the Roman encounter with Greek culture and whose character was modest enough and similar enough to certain aspects of Aphrodite to make the identification feel natural. The two figures merged, over a period of several centuries, into a single entity who was simultaneously both and neither, a goddess with Greek mythology and Latin name, with Olympian genealogy and Roman political function, with a family tree that connected back to the sea foam of the ancient Mediterranean and forward to the specific bloodline that was going to organise the most powerful state in the Western world. The political dimension that the Romans added to Venus's portfolio was not gradual or accidental. It was the result of a specific political manoeuvre by one of the most consequential families in Roman history. The gens Julia, the Julian clan from which Julius Caesar and his adopted heir Augustus descended, claimed Venus as their divine ancestor through a lineage that ran from the goddess through her son Aeneas, the Trojan hero who had fled the burning city and eventually made his way to Italy, to Aeneas's son Iulus, and from Iulus to the Julian family itself. This genealogical claim was not a private family tradition. It was political theology, and it was deployed in public life with the full resources of the most powerful family in the Roman world. Julius Caesar himself was particularly committed to the divine ancestry claim. He dedicated a temple to Venus Genetrix, Venus the Mother, in the forum that bore his name, and he made the connection between his family and the goddess of love a consistent theme of his public self-presentation. This was not merely vanity, though it contained vanity. It was a sophisticated piece of religious political communication in a world where divine ancestry was one of the most powerful sources of legitimate authority available. If your family descended from Venus, you were not merely a powerful Roman. You were the inheritor of a divine mandate that had been operating since before Rome existed, since before the Trojan War, since the goddess of love had chosen to invest in a particular heroic bloodline and committed to the long-term project of producing a civilization worthy of her. Augustus, Caesar's heir, and the first Roman emperor in any meaningful sense, took this theological framework and built it into the ideological foundation of the imperial system with a thoroughness that his adopted father had only begun. The Aeneid, the great Roman epic that Virgil wrote under Augustus's patronage, and which is generally considered the most politically sophisticated poem in the Latin language, is, among other things, a sustained argument for the divine legitimacy of the Augustan order, and Venus functions throughout it as one of the primary divine forces working to bring that order into existence. She protects Aeneas. She intervenes at critical moments to prevent his destruction. She argues his case before Jupiter when the situation requires divine adjudication. She's not the Venus of the bedroom and the garden and the pleasant spring morning. She's a cosmic force working toward a specific political outcome across a long-time horizon, the divine architect of a destiny that will culminate in the foundation of Rome and the eventual rule of her descendants. This is a goddess with a project. The project is civilization. The divine love goddess had become, in Roman hands, the patron of empire building, which would have been a surprising career development to anyone who knew her primarily from the Golden Net episode. The Temple of Venus and Roma, built by the Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century CE, and for a long time the largest temple in the Roman world, placed Venus's cult at the physical centre of the Roman imperial city, adjacent to the Colosseum and within sight of the Forum. The temple had 2 facing cells, one dedicated to Venus as the mother of the Roman people, and one to Roma as the goddess of the eternal city, which was an architectural statement about the theology of Roman imperial identity, love and civilization, origin and permanence, the divine force that generated the Roman bloodline and the divine force that embodied Roman achievement, placed face to face in a building whose scale communicated the seriousness of the claim. This was not a small religious building maintained by a modest priesthood. It was an imperial statement in stone, and it said, with the directness that architecture achieves more efficiently than any other medium, "This is where we come from, this is what we are, and both of these things are divine." What the Roman adoption of Venus demonstrates about the longevity of the tradition is something that the pattern of the entire history has been building toward, that the goddess survived each transition not by remaining identical through it, but by acquiring new dimensions relevant to each new cultural context, while retaining the essential quality that made her necessary in the first place. She arrived in Rome from Greece already carrying Mesopotamian and Phoenician and Cypriot layers. In Rome, she acquired the political dimension that the Greek tradition had kept at arm's length. The specific investment in the destiny of a particular lineage, the function as divine ancestor of a ruling house, the theological justification of a political order. None of this replaced what she had been. It added to it, the way each century of the Cypriot sanctuary had added a new layer to what was already there. The Neoplatonic tradition of late antiquity produced the most philosophically elaborate treatment of the goddess's dual nature since Plato himself had introduced the distinction between heavenly and earthly Aphrodite in the Symposium. The Neoplatonists, philosophers working primarily in the 3rd through 5th centuries CE, in Alexandria and Rome and Athens, in a period when the Roman Empire was undergoing the cultural and religious transformations that would eventually produce medieval European civilization, took Plato's 2 Aphrodites and developed them into a comprehensive metaphysical system for understanding the relationship between divine and earthly love. In the Neoplatonic framework, the heavenly Aphrodite, Aphrodite Urania, was not simply the patroness of more refined romantic preferences. She was the embodiment of the soul's love for the divine, the force that drew the individual human consciousness toward the transcendent reality that the Neoplatonists called the One, the ultimate source of all being. Eros in this framework was not simply desire in any ordinary human sense. It was the cosmic impulse toward reunion with the source, the force that drove everything that existed toward the fullness from which it had descended. Human desire was, in this reading, the lowest and most material expression of a principle that operated at every level of existence simultaneously, from the individual body's desire for another body, through the soul's desire for wisdom and beauty, to the divine intellect's contemplation of the One. This was an extraordinary philosophical development of the tradition, and it was historically consequential far beyond its immediate philosophical context. The Neoplatonic framework for understanding love was absorbed into early Christian theology with a thoroughness that subsequent centuries have sometimes forgotten. The Christian tradition's distinction between carnal and spiritual love, between earthly and heavenly desire, between love that binds the soul to the material world and love that draws it toward the divine, is the Neoplatonic framework operating under new names. Augustine of Hippo, whose own famous pre-conversion engagement with love and desire gave him a personal investment in the theological question, drew heavily on Neoplatonic concepts in developing the Christian theology of love that shaped Western thinking for the next 1,000 years. The goddess who had started as a foam-born figure in Hesiod was now, several layers of philosophical transformation later, providing the conceptual framework for Christian mystical theology. She was that productive as an idea. The medieval period, which popular imagination tends to picture as uniformly hostile to the goddess of love and everything she represented, was in fact considerably more ambivalent about her than the simple narrative of Christian suppression of pagan religion would suggest. The Church officially condemned the worship of pagan deities naturally. What it could not so easily manage was the persistence of the images, stories, and conceptual frameworks that Aphrodite's tradition had generated across several thousand years of continuous cultural production. Medieval literature is full of Venus, not as an object of worship, which would have been theologically problematic, but as a literary figure, an allegorical personification, a convenient vehicle for discussing desire and its consequences in a cultural framework that had not yet developed a fully satisfying alternative vocabulary for these subjects. Chaucer's work is saturated with Venus, who appears in several of the Canterbury Tales and in Troilus and Chryseid with a frequency and elaboration that suggests less the polite literary convention of invoking a classical goddess and more the genuine persistence of a tradition that the author found intellectually useful and emotionally resonant. Dante's Divine Comedy places Venus in the 3rd sphere of paradise, a theologically audacious location for a pagan goddess, softened into the heaven of souls who are dominated by love in their earthly lives, which is a remarkable piece of theological accommodation that says something about the difficulty of simply eliminating a figure with 3,000 years of cultural presence behind her. You could not leave Venus out of a comprehensive account of the cosmos and its order. She was too embedded in the vocabulary of love to be removed without leaving a hole that nothing else could fill. The Italian Renaissance was the moment when the tradition of Aphrodite and Venus re-emerged into explicit, unashamed, philosophically serious cultural production in the Western world, and it did so with a speed and completeness that suggests it had been waiting for the right conditions rather than having been genuinely absent during the centuries before. The Neoplatonic Academy in Florence, the circle of scholars gathered around Marsilio Ficino under the patronage of the Medici family in the latter half of the 15th century, produced a philosophical revival of the ancient tradition of love that connected directly back to Plato's Symposium and the Neoplatonic elaborations of late antiquity, and which provided the intellectual framework within which the most famous visual images of the tradition were created. Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, painted somewhere around 1484 to 1486, and now so thoroughly reproduced that it has achieved the curious cultural status of being simultaneously one of the most famous images in Western art and one of the most taken for granted, was produced within this Neoplatonic context, and it is considerably more philosophically specific than its current role as a decorative standard suggests. The painting depicts the moment of the goddess's arrival on shore, the hours waiting with a garment, the figure emerging from the sea in a pose that the art historical tradition has connected to ancient sculptural models. But it does so with an iconographic precision that was legible to its original audience in ways that the modern reproduction tradition has largely obscured. The Venus of Botticelli is not a pretty picture of a woman in a shell. She is a philosophical statement about the nature of divine beauty and its relationship to the human soul, made in the visual language that Ficino and his circle had developed to communicate Neoplatonic ideas to a patron class that was receptive to images as well as texts. Botticelli also painted Primavera, Spring, whose central figure is conventionally identified as Venus, presiding over a garden that is simultaneously a representation of the material world, a Neoplatonic allegory about the descent of divine beauty into earthly form, and a seasonal image whose roots go back through the medieval tradition to the ancient Adonia festivals and their celebration of the goddess of spring. The painting contains the three graces dancing, Mercury with his caduceus, Zephyrus pursuing the nymph Chloris, and at the centre, Venus with one hand raised in a gesture that has been interpreted variously as welcome, instruction, or benediction. The figure has been presiding over spring for 2,500 years in various forms, and Botticelli's version is one link in a chain that runs continuously back to the flowers that grew behind Aphrodite's footsteps as she came ashore on Cyprus. Shakespeare engaged with the Venus tradition in a register that was more literary than philosophical, but no less seriously. His narrative poem Venus and Adonis, published in 1593 and enormously popular in its own time, running through multiple editions in a way that suggests it was not considered minor work, takes the ancient myth and transforms it into a sustained exploration of desire and its relationship to power, youth, and mortality. Shakespeare's Venus is considerably more aggressive than the traditional version, pursuing Adonis with an insistence that makes the power dynamics of the mythological original explicit in ways that ancient sources tended to leave implicit. His Adonis is resistant in ways that the ancient version was not, which gives the poem a quality of frustrated desire that the ancient myth, in which Adonis's tragedy was death rather than disinterest, does not quite have. The transformation reveals something about what each period needed from the myth. The ancient world used Adonis to think about mortality and the seasons. The Renaissance used him to think about the nature of desire itself, and the specific complications of wanting someone who does not want you back with equivalent intensity. The philosophical tradition of the ancient world arrived in modernity through a route that included all of the transformations above, and then took one more significant turn in the work of Sigmund Freud, whose concept of the libido is the most consequential modern descendant of the ancient eros in the technical philosophical sense. Freud himself was aware of this lineage. He was a classically educated European intellectual of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, for whom ancient Greek concepts were available as intellectual frameworks in a way that is less automatic for most educated people today. And he used the name eros deliberately, understanding that he was placing his psychological theory in relationship to a tradition that went back through Plato to the ancient cosmological principle of attraction. The libido, in Freud's framework, was not simply sexual energy in the reductive sense that popular misunderstanding tends to assign to it. It was the general energy of desire, the life force, the drive toward connection and creation, and the expansion of the self beyond its current boundaries, of which sexual desire was a specific expression rather than the whole content. This is, in its structure, very close to what the ancient tradition had understood as eros at the cosmological level, the force of attraction that operated at every level of existence, of which human sexual desire was the most immediate and personal form, but not the only, or even the most important form. Freud was not repackaging ancient theology as psychology. He was independently arriving through the observation of his patients and the construction of his theoretical system, at a position that the ancient world had occupied for entirely different reasons and through entirely different methods, which is either a remarkable confirmation of the ancient insight or a remarkable demonstration of how deeply the ancient framework had shaped the intellectual tradition from which Freud was working, or both simultaneously. The 20th century produced its own engagement with the tradition in forms that range from the purely popular to the seriously artistic, and the range is itself evidence of the tradition's continued vitality. The planet Venus, named in antiquity for the goddess, visible to the naked eye as the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon, known as both the morning star and the evening star in the same identification that connected the planet to Inanna and Ishtar in the Mesopotamian tradition, became, in the 20th century, a subject of direct scientific investigation that revealed it to be one of the most inhospitable environments in the solar system. Surface temperatures of nearly 900 degrees Fahrenheit, atmospheric pressure 90 times that of Earth, clouds of sulfuric acid. The goddess of love and beauty turns out to be the planet that would kill you most efficiently in the shortest time. The ancient world, which had seen the planet as the most beautiful object in the night sky, would perhaps have found this deeply appropriate. Beauty and danger, as established at considerable length, were always part of the same tradition. Alternatively, they would have simply found it very funny. The contemporary persistence of the tradition is visible in places that tend to be discussed separately from each other, but which are expressions of the same underlying continuity. The practice of giving flowers, especially red roses, on Valentine's Day connects to the ancient sacred flower of Aphrodite through a lineage that runs through Roman festival traditions, medieval poetic convention, and Renaissance iconography, without ever entirely losing the thread. The phrase __quote_20 __ preserves the ancient understanding of desire as something that happens to you, that you descend into rather than arrive at through gradual approach, which is the eros as arrow model in linguistic form, operating in contemporary speech in people who have never heard of Hesiod and would find the connection surprising. The association of the colour red with romantic love, of the heart as the organ of desire, of birds, particularly doves, as symbols of affection. All of these have ancient roots in the tradition, transmitted through cultural channels that are largely invisible to the people using the symbols, precisely because the symbols have become so natural that their origins are not apparent. The figure of Aphrodite in contemporary popular culture tends to be simultaneously overexposed and underunderstood, present everywhere in advertising, in the aesthetic vocabulary of beauty products and fashion, and the vast commercial enterprise that has grown up around the experience of desire, and yet rarely encountered in the full complexity of what the ancient tradition was actually saying about what she was and what she meant. The Valentine's Day version of the tradition, soft, decorative, commercially useful, is the most visible contemporary expression of something that was, at its origin and throughout most of its history, a great deal stranger, and more interesting and more philosophically serious than pink hearts and winged babies would suggest. What is genuinely remarkable about the persistence of the tradition across 5,000 years and multiple civilizations is not that it has survived, because many things survive in some form. What is remarkable is that it has survived while remaining recognizable, that you can trace a continuous line from Inanna in Sumer to Ishtar in Babylon, to Astarte in Phoenicia, to the Bronze Age sanctuary on Cyprus, to the Olympian tradition, to Plato's Symposium, to the Roman Venus genetrics, to Botticelli's Shore, to Freud's libido, to the contemporary culture of desire and its commercial expression, and at every point in that line find something that is identifiably the same essential conversation. Different names, different frames, different cultural contexts, different specific concerns, but the same fundamental recognition that the force of desire and beauty was important enough to think about carefully, important enough to give a face and a name and a temple, important enough to build a philosophy around and a politics around and an art around and a psychology around. The reason it has remained important enough to do all of these things is not complicated, though it has taken the entire span of recorded history to fully articulate. The force that Aphrodite represents, the specific combination of beauty and desire, and the overwhelming urgency of wanting something that exceeds all rational calculation, is not an aberration in human experience. It is not a distraction from the important things. It is one of the important things, arguably the most consistently present and personally consequential of the important things, the one that operates without reference to your other priorities, and that has been making itself felt in human lives since before the first word was written down about it, and will continue making itself felt long after the last word has been. This is what the ancient world understood in giving her a place of honour in the divine order. Not that desire was comfortable or manageable or reliably productive of good outcomes. The mythology makes abundantly clear that it is none of these things, consistently and across many examples, but that it was real and fundamental and worthy of serious attention and in possession of a power that was too genuine to be either worshipped without caution or dismissed without consequence. She was not a goddess of happiness. She was a goddess of something more important and more complicated than happiness, the raw, generative, occasionally catastrophic experience of being a conscious being in a world full of other conscious beings toward whom you can feel something. She has been walking ashore since before civilization had words for the walk. The grass has been growing behind her the whole time. Sleep well, and if tonight someone or something finds its way into your dreams, the kind of dream that leaves you different in the morning than you were the night before, well, you know who to thank. Sweet dreams. The art history of Venus after Botticelli is a story of relentless return. Artists coming back to the same figure, the same pose, the same symbolic vocabulary, each generation finding something in the tradition that felt essential to what they were trying to say about beauty and desire, and the human relationship to both. Titian's Venus of Urbino, painted in 1538, took Botticelli's celestial figure and placed her squarely in a Venetian bedroom, looking directly at the viewer with an expression that art historians have been arguing about for 5 centuries. She's not transcendent, she's present. She is, in the most direct possible sense, there, in the room, on the bed, in the specific weight and warmth of a body that exists in the same physical space as the person looking at it. Titian's Venus is not the Neoplatonic heavenly force. She is the earthly Aphrodite, and the painting makes no apology for this. Both Aphrodites, as Plato had already established, were legitimate. The tradition was large enough for both. Velázquez's Rokeby Venus, painted around 1647 to 1651 and the only surviving female nude by the artist, placed the goddess with her back to the viewer, examining herself in a mirror held by Cupid, in a compositional arrangement that introduced a quality of privacy and interiority that the Italian tradition had not quite achieved. Her face is visible in the mirror's reflection, but dimly, as if the full clarity of her identity is being withheld, which is either a technical limitation of painting a mirror reflection or a deliberate philosophical choice about the nature of divine beauty, and the tradition's history suggests it was probably both simultaneously. The painting was attacked by a suffragette activist in 1914, slashed with a meat cleaver in the National Gallery in London, which added to its story a dimension that the mythological Venus would probably have found thoroughly in keeping with the tradition of love and destruction that had characterized her mythology since the beginning. The Romantic period produced its own engagement with the tradition through the figure of the dangerous woman, the femme fatale of 19th century art and literature, who combined irresistible attraction with the capacity for destruction in a combination that owed an enormous debt to the ancient tradition, even when its practitioners would not have phrased the connection in those terms. The specific anxiety that the Romantic and Victorian periods expressed about feminine beauty and its relationship to male vulnerability was a late expression of the ancient Greek understanding that desire was dangerous, that the force embodied by the goddess was one that operated outside of rational control and produced consequences that no amount of careful preparation could entirely prevent. The cultural expression changed. The underlying theological concern remained identical. In literature, the tradition maintained its vitality through exactly the mechanism that Sappho had demonstrated was possible in the 7th century BCE, the direct personal address to the goddess as a living presence rather than a historical figure. Yeats' poem Leda and the Swan, which approaches the tradition from the violent origin stories that the 20th century found more congenial than the romanticized versions, treated divine desire and its mortal consequences with a seriousness that connected directly back to the theological weight that the ancient tradition had given to the intersection of divine and human experience. Rilke's invocations of Eros and beauty in the Duino elegies operated in a register that owed more to the Neoplatonic tradition than to any modern literary convention, using the ancient language of divine love to address questions about mortality and meaning that had not become any less urgent in the 2,000 years since the Neoplatonists first developed the framework. The 20th century's most significant contribution to the tradition may have been, unexpectedly, the development of evolutionary psychology and neuroscience as frameworks for understanding desire, which arrived at conclusions about the operation of attraction in the human nervous system that are, in their basic structure, remarkably consistent with what the ancient tradition had been saying for millennia in theological rather than scientific language. The ancient understanding that desire operated outside of rational control, that it arrived without warning and reorganized the person's perceptual and motivational systems around its object, that it was experienced as happening to the person rather than being chosen by them. All of this is confirmed by contemporary neuroscience's account of what occurs in the human brain during states of attraction and desire. The specific neural mechanisms differ from the ancient theological descriptions in every particular. The phenomenological account they produce is the same. This convergence is not mystical. It is simply what happens when two very different methods of careful observation are applied to the same phenomenon over long periods of time. They arrive at similar descriptions of the thing they are both observing. The ancient world observed desire in the lives of its people, and in the literary and mythological accounts it produced of those lives, and it constructed a theology adequate to what it saw. Contemporary science observes desire in the activity of the brain and the behavior of individuals and populations, and it constructs a model adequate to what it measures. The goddess and the neurotransmitter are not in competition. They are descriptions of the same thing in different languages, at different levels of analysis, for different purposes. The most honest account of what Aphrodite has been across the 5,000 years of her documented history is probably this. She has been the tradition through which human civilization has tried to take seriously the force of desire and beauty, in all their complexity and power and danger and generativity. Each civilization that encountered her added something to the account. The Mesopotamian tradition added the martial dimension. The Phoenician tradition added the mercantile and universal dimensions. The Greek tradition added the philosophical analysis. The Roman tradition added the political dimension. The Renaissance added the aesthetic elaboration. The modern tradition has added the psychological and scientific frameworks, and the accumulated account is, by now, one of the richest and most thoroughly examined aspects of human experience in the entire archive of human thought. The goddess from the sea was, in the end, not simply a figure of mythology or religion or philosophy or art or psychology. She was the figure through which human beings across 5,000 years and multiple civilizations kept returning to the same necessary and difficult recognition that the force of desire was real, that it was powerful, that it deserved serious attention, and that the person who tried to live as if it did not exist was making a mistake at least as significant as the person who tried to live as if it were the only thing that existed. She represented the middle path, not in the sense of moderation, but in the sense of genuine engagement, taking the force seriously enough to think carefully about what it was and how to live with it, neither dismissing it nor being completely consumed by it, finding the specific quality of awareness that allowed you to be fully present to its operation in your life without losing everything else in the process. That is, in the end, what the temples were for, not to worship desire, but to take it seriously enough to give it an address. And on that note, wherever you are right now, whatever hour it is, whatever brought you here tonight to the story of a goddess born from ancient waters and older than civilization itself, thank you for staying until the end. The world is still full of her, if you know how to look. Sweet dreams, and good night.